You wake before the sun has fully risen, the faint gray of dawn just beginning to press against the edges of the paper shoji screens. The air inside the tea room is cool and carries the faint scent of straw from the tatami mats. You kneel slowly, your knees and ankles settling into their familiar place upon the woven floor. The light is still dim enough that the room feels almost outside of time, its corners softened, the colors muted. A kettle rests upon the hearth, its iron sides catching the barest glimmer from the single oil lamp flickering near the alcove. The tea room is not grand. It is small on purpose, a size that forces the mind to focus on the people within it. 4.5 tatami mats, each one the same width and length, a measure that feels quietly mathematical. This is not an accident. Tea rooms are designed to quiet the spirit through proportion as much as through action. Historians generally agree that such rooms in the 16th century were meant to humble even the highest-ranking guests. The low entrance door would force even the proudest samurai to bow, armor or not. You rest your hand on the floor and feel the ridges of the woven rush under your fingertips. The smell of fresh tatami is sharper than hay but softer than grass, a scent that drifts upward whenever the mat is brushed by movement. You take a moment to breathe it in, as the air outside carries a faint chill. The wind brushes across the garden, and you hear the rustle of pine needles beyond the wall. The tokonoma alcove stands in quiet shadow, save for a hanging scroll with brushstrokes so simple that the mind wants to add more than is there. Perhaps the characters say peace, or perhaps they say something else entirely. Historians still argue whether certain scrolls were chosen for their philosophical meaning, or simply because the host liked their appearance. The truth is probably both, though in tea gatherings, truth is a flexible guest. You step forward and lightly run your cloth along the edge of the lacquered table, though nothing rests on it yet. The surface catches the faint light, its deep black reflecting the outline of your sleeve. There is no hurry. There never is in the tea room. If you finish your task quickly, you will simply have more time to notice how dust falls differently in the still air compared to the breeze outside. It is here, in this hush, that etiquette begins. Not with a bow or a cup, but with the decision to move slowly. Samurai who entered these rooms learned that control over their own hands was as important as control over a blade. To fumble a tea scoop would not endanger life, but it would endanger face. In time, the restraint learned here would carry into other matters, into conversation, negotiation, and the unspoken language of status. A small sparrow lands somewhere outside, its claws scratching faintly on a branch. You pause to listen, feeling the slight sway of the room, as if it too is adjusting to the day. There is no need to check the hour. The tea will be made when the moment feels right, and not before. The moment, like the water, will be heated gradually until it is ready to be poured. You remain still, the folds of your robe pooling gently at your sides, the scent of tatami and faint iron in your nose, waiting for the kettle's first sigh. You reach for the soft dusting cloth. It's weaved smooth but with just enough texture to catch stray motes before they settle again. The lacquered table waits, low and broad, its surface the deep, patient black of night water. You begin at one corner, sliding the cloth in long, even passes, neither rushing nor lingering more than the rhythm allows. Each movement follows the quiet etiquette you have, repeated countless times, not because someone is watching, but because someone might be. In the tea room, the possibility of observation shapes behavior as much as actual eyes upon you. It is said among scholars that samurai refined their public demeanor here, where each small action could be weighed for balance and grace. A cloth that moves too quickly may speak of impatience. One that hesitates too long may suggest uncertainty. Both are impolite. The scent of the lacquer rises faintly under the pressure of your hand, mingling with the tatami's grass-like aroma. Somewhere beyond the thin walls, a bamboo fountain tips and empties into a stone basin with a hollow sound, a sound that will repeat in another few breaths, and another after that, marking time in a way the tea ceremony prefers. Irregular, but certain. You pause to fold the cloth over itself, trapping any dust so it cannot wander back to the table. This is habit, though historians still debate whether such careful folding was a formal rule in early ceremonies or simply the mark of a conscientious host. In either case, it remains an unspoken standard now. The best etiquette is rarely announced aloud. It reveals itself in the hands of those who already know. A shaft of pale sunlight slips across the floor, catching the lacquer's glossy edge. You follow its line with your eyes, watching how it stretches slowly as the day leans further from dawn. The light does not hurry. It moves with the patience of something that knows it cannot be stopped. There is a small nick near the center of the table, invisible unless the angle is just right. You touch it with the cloth, not to remove it, it cannot be removed, but to acknowledge it. Perfection in the tea room is not the same as flawlessness. The tea bowl with the small chip, the kettle with the faint warp, the table with the tiny scar, these are accepted, even valued, as reminders that use and time cannot be separated from beauty. The air stirs faintly as you finish the final pass. The cloth is folded again, corner to corner, a soft square now resting in your palm. There is satisfaction in returning it to its place without any sound beyond the whisper of fabric on wood. The table gleams, not ostentatiously, but in the way a polished riverstone might gleam when lifted into the light. A thin curl of steam escapes from the kettle in the hearth, twisting upward until it vanishes against the dim rafters. You glance at it only briefly. It is not yet the time to tend to it. The table is ready, and in that readiness is a stillness that spreads to the rest of the room. The garden outside is quiet, save for a distant crow whose call seems too large for the morning. You take a step back on your knees, folding your legs beneath you once more, and place your hands lightly on your thighs. The work is done, but you will remain here for a few breaths longer, letting the calm settle into your shoulders. The dust is gone, but the habit of moving slowly remains, like the aftertaste of tea that lingers even after the last sip is taken. You take the folded fukusa from where it rests, the silk soft yet firm enough to hold its shape. Its color is a deep, steady crimson, the kind of red that seems to drink in the light rather than reflect it. You place it on your knee, smoothing it gently with your palm. The cloth holds a faint warmth from where it has been resting against your body, and the silk fibers whisper under your touch. The folding is not merely a way to keep the cloth tidy. It is a gesture of readiness, a signal that what follows will be deliberate. Samurai came to understand that the control required here of silk and fingers, of movement and pause, was the same control required in matters beyond the tea room. A sword can be drawn quickly, but respect is shown in how it is sheathed. The tea cloth teaches the same truth. You fold the fukusa in half, then again, the edges aligning with quiet precision. The rhythm is slow but certain, as though you have done this so often, your hands understand before your mind needs to instruct them. A small breath escapes you as you smooth the final fold. You have learned to let the breath match the motion. It steadies the pace and keeps the folds unhurried. Historians still argue whether the exact folding pattern was standardized in Sen no Rikyu's time, or whether variations were common between schools. Some records describe the folds as symbolic, others as purely practical. You suspect both are true, though the symbols change with the one who holds the cloth. A faint breeze drifts in from the garden through the slightly open shoji, carrying the cool scent of earth and damp moss. It stirs the corner of the cloth before you catch it and press it back into place. The fukusa feels alive for a moment, as if it has its own opinion on how it should rest. You let the thought pass without judgment. Once folded, the cloth is tucked neatly at your side, ready to purify the utensils when the time comes. The weight of it against your sash is light, yet somehow grounding. You notice how it falls in a straight line, the folds crisp and exact. These small observations, repeated over years, have a way of reshaping how you move in all things. You rest your hands briefly on your knees, the sleeves of your robe sliding softly against your wrists. Beyond the wall, water trickles in the stone basin again. Its sound different than before, a fuller pour, perhaps from a recent rainfall. You look down at the fukusa, its quiet red against the soft beige of your robe, and feel the room settle into an even deeper stillness. The kettle in the hearth exhales a faint sigh, the first true sign that the water is nearing readiness. You do not move toward it yet. The fukusa is folded, the table is clean, and the air is heavy with the scent of tatami and steam. All is in place for the next quiet task. You lift the lid of the iron kettle with 2 fingers and a breath, as if the steam itself could be startled. The kama sits in the hearth like a dark moon, set into the square, cut into the floor. The charcoal glows low and steady, arranged earlier so the heat would rise with a patient mind. You tilt the lid a finger's width to let the warmth grow and the sound deepen. The kettle answers you with a murmur that has a name older than your own practice. Wind in the pines. The phrase is everywhere in tea records. A simple truth repeated until it becomes a rule: the water should not rage, it should breathe. The iron has its own scent, faintly mineral, softened by humidity. You feel it in your nose the way you might feel the trace of rain before the first drop lands. The hearth air is warmer than the room, by just enough to remind you that heat is a living thing, and that your task is not to force it but to accompany it. You do not prod the coals. You nudge them with that careful humility learned on winter mornings when smoke threatens to curl where it should not. A longer charcoal takes the center. A shorter one leans close, as if listening. What you do now is quiet work, the kind that samurai learned to respect despite its domestic look. Everyone knows the broad fact: the tea kettle, the kama, is the heart of the gathering, its sound and temperature guiding every gesture. The etiquette around it is not flashy, but it rewires your patience. You wait for the kettle rather than make the kettle wait for you. The discipline transfers. A commander who can wait for water to speak can wait for tempers to cool. You keep your sleeve tucked away so the silk will not flirt with flames. The long-handled ladle rests nearby, its bowl facing downward, so stray ash will not settle where you do not want it. When you test the water, you do it gently, returning the ladle to its cradle with no clatter. Your fingers memorize distances: lid to rim, rim to handle, handle to the place your hand must reclaim. Nothing is ever truly put down. It is simply returned to where it belongs. Steam gathers along the edge of the lid and beads into a thin necklace of droplets. One lets go and vanishes with a breath of sound. You do not chase the boil. You encourage it with the kind of attention that seems, from the outside, to be nothing at all. The kettle's voice changes from whisper to soft conversation. If it ever begins to chatter, you tilt the lid a touch more, inviting some of the excitement to drift away. There is a small joy you would not admit aloud. This kettle has a personality. Many hosts and collectors quietly name their kettles, a habit as unfashionable to boast about as it is impossible to resist in private. The name is not grand. It might be something like shallow wind or early pine, scratched in brush on the underside of the storage box lid by a former owner. The inscription does not improve the water, but it does improve your manners toward the object. You handle it like an elder whose stories you already know by heart. The sound of the water is never exactly the same twice. Some say, in old notes, that the best kettles were cast so their inner surface would play the steam like a flute. Others say this is romance added after the fact. Historians still argue whether the preference for a subdued kettle voice came first and wabi aesthetics followed, or whether the spread of wabi ideals taught ears to prefer a quieter murmur. You do not solve the question. You simply lean a little closer and let the steam touch your cheekbones before it vanishes. The season matters. When the year is cold, the sun sits low and the hearth is opened in the floor. When the air turns mild, the portable brazier takes its place. You are in that in-between time when the chill lingers in corners, a moment that excuses a slightly fuller fire. The etiquette of fire is like any other etiquette. It exists to keep company comfortable without calling attention to itself. No guest should think about warmth. They should simply be warm. You study the charcoal's edges, white where the heat has done its quiet work, black where it will continue. Adjustments are few and unhurried. When you move a piece, you do it with tongs that make a soft tick against the iron stand. You aim for a heat that lifts the water to readiness without teaching it bad habits. Water that boils too vigorously grows coarse. Water that never quite wakes becomes shy, and the tea tells you so with a weary flavor. A thin line of light slides across the kettle's shoulder, and you see the old scratches that record other mornings like this one. The handle's curve throws its shadow along the lid like a drawn bow at rest. You raise the lid again, just enough to keep the voice where you want it. The steam knots and releases in small patterns, like breath on a cold day. You resist the urge to interpret the shapes as omens. They are only steam. That is enough. You dip the ladle toward the well bucket to your side and draw up cool water. The difference in temperature matters. Too much and your careful heat will sulk. Too little and the kettle will soon demand the last of your charcoal. You dribble a measured ribbon into the mouth of the kettle. The sound lowers in pitch, then settles, like a singer finding the note they meant all along. The addition of fresh water keeps the flavor delicate when you begin to whisk. This is common knowledge in every school that bothers to write things down, though each writes it with the certainty that theirs is the best phrasing. A fringe habit, unspoken but not rare, has you set the lid so it rests a hair off center, not from carelessness but to tune the voice. Beginners think the effect is imagined, but with time, the ear learns the difference between tidy and tuned. You let the lid stay there, not quite symmetrical, the almost imperfection that makes the sound breathe as if through a reed. The room approves in its silent way. If you listen too long, it becomes easy to believe the kettle is speaking words. It is not, but the steadiness is persuasive, and your shoulders agree to lower by their own decision. Outside the wall, a crow cuts the morning with a call that has none of the kettle's tact. Inside, the iron keeps its temper and keeps teaching you yours. You watch the steam for a while without any plan but watching. The kettle offers no drama, and you return the courtesy. When you finally rest the lid flat, the sound quiets to a secret, and you understand that the water is not ready because it boils. It is ready because everything in the room now moves at the same speed. You move toward the shelf with its quiet ranks of tea bowls, each turned a little away, as if the bowls prefer to be discovered rather than offered. You pause with your hands on your knees and look rather than reach. Choosing is part of the ceremony. Haste would be a kind of rudeness toward clay. The light through the paper screens is even and pale, giving every glaze the same modest chance to speak. You consider the plain truth first, the one repeated until it has worn smooth. For the guest, the bowl is the world. A competent host could prepare fine tea in a poor bowl, yet a poor choice would still bend the mood. Your eyes travel from a pale ash glaze, caught like frost on a pond, to a matte, ember-dark surface that keeps the memory of kiln smoke. Somewhere the kettle breathes. Somewhere the bamboo fountain knocks softly against stone. The sounds move around your choice like patient attendants, but they do not decide. You lift one bowl with two hands and feel its weight before you judge its looks. Warmth will gather in this shape and linger long enough to be noticed. The rim is slightly uneven. The lip rises and falls like a quiet shoreline. You run your thumb inside the curve and think of winter mornings. A mainstream fact follows you into this inspection. In the age of celebrated tea masters, humble, tactile bowls, later linked with a lineage of makers remembered by a single, simple word, became favored for their steadiness and unshowy grace. Their rough, warmth-trained warriors to prize restraint over display. You set the bowl back and lift another. This one carries a soft, smoky red, the color of clay fired low and sure. The interior holds a spiral where a thumb once pushed the wall outward. You can feel the maker without seeing him. You are not required to recite names, yet one rises anyway. A potter who worked closely with a famed master in the 16th century, a partnership often credited with shaping taste towards simple bowls. Scholars still debate how much of that tidy story belongs to memory and how much to later arranging. The bowls themselves refuse to comment. A third bowl shows golden veins where it once cracked and was coaxed back to life with lacquer and powdered metal. The seams do not hide the break, they turn it into a path. You run a finger near, not on, the line, and think how a mended edge can feel steadier than a perfect one. The habit of honoring repair is now so familiar that guests nod when they see it, as if a scar could lift its chin and bow. The etiquette lesson is plain. A thing may break and still return with dignity, and so may a person. You try an austere vessel with pale glaze pooled like thin ice near the foot. Its walls are higher, the mouth narrower, favoring heat in the colder months. Another bowl, wide and open, asks for spring. Season sits in clay just as surely as in shoots and blossoms. Bringing a snow season bowl into a humidity-heavy day would not be forbidden, but it would be tone-deaf, and tone is most of manners. You turn the winter bowl so its best face points away. You will remember it when the air loses its softness. A fringe habit rises and you indulge it. You draw out the wooden storage box in which one bowl sleeps between gatherings. Inside the lid, a former owner has brushed a plain name, something like Quiet Ford or Evening Field. Many bowls carry such names, whispered rather than announced, and some hosts speak to them in the privacy of preparation as if to an old friend. You do not do so now. You simply replace the lid and let the name be sufficient company for the bowl. Your hand hesitates over a vessel with sandy, slightly pitted glaze, the kind that recalls coarse rice bowls used far from courtly halls. Warriors once admired such rustic pieces not only for their look, but for what the look declared. That polish without purpose can dull the senses. Scholars write tidy explanations for this taste, but historians still argue whether the turn away from glossy perfection was a sincere embrace of plainness or a fashionable posture worn comfortably in a refined circle. You allow the uncertainty to sit beside you like a quiet guest. You tip a wide bowl under the light and see tiny pinholes where bubbles once paid their dues to heat. You roll the foot ring across your palm and feel the bare clay, rough as a path after rain. The weight sits low, willing to rest where you put it. You turn the bowl until you find the mark that declares its front, the brush or stamp the guest will politely avoid when drinking. You imagine how the bowl will be rotated with a small courtesy before the first sip, a lesson in deference enacted without speech. This is how tea slips into etiquette, not through lectures, but through the body remembering kindness. You imagine warmth soaking into the chosen bowl, the glaze deepening a shade for a few breaths before drying. You imagine the sound it will make against the mat when you place it down. A hush, not a tap. You test the rim again. It is friendly to the mouth, neither knife thin nor clumsy. It will ask the guest to drink slowly, and the guest will answer. Beyond the screens, wind fingers the bamboo leaves and then thinks better of it. The room receives the small stirring and offers you patience in return. You lift the bowl to your face and inhale the clean, dry scent of clay that has slept a long, good sleep. There is no urgency. Tea rewards the one who lets choosing keep its own walking pace. You return the other bowls to stillness and keep the chosen piece in both hands. You picture a warrior of rank kneeling where you kneel, fingers memorizing a similar curve, learning to prefer deliberate smallness over careless largeness. Many records note the same gentle lesson. Men who trained their hands here often found their temper steadier elsewhere. Not because clay is magic, but because repetition teaches obedience to quiet. Before you rise, you allow yourself one more glance at the shelf. Somewhere among these pieces are bowls with stories so tangled that even experts cannot unclasp them. Provenances overlap, inscriptions contradict. A famous name kisses a questionable box. Historians still argue whether several celebrated bowls were truly used by the figures to whom they are now devoted, or whether devotion wrote itself backward onto the wood. You accept the doubt as you accept a faint glaze run near a foot. Not a flaw to erase, but a reminder that heat moves as it pleases. You carry the bowl to its place by the hearth. The kettle's breath greets it like an elder acknowledging a child. Your sleeves fall back a finger's width. Your thumbs meet along the rim for a moment before parting. The choice settles into your arms with the weight of something that has agreed to be useful. When you set the bowl down, clay meets tatami with a sound so soft it nearly disappears. The room, pleased, says nothing. Your hands rest on your thighs again, empty for a heartbeat, and then ready to reach for the next quiet task. You take up the bamboo chashaku as if it might startle and leap away if seized too quickly. It does not. It lies there with the lightness of something that has only one job and intends to do it well. The scoop's curve is gentle, almost shy, bending near the tip where the green powder will rest for a moment, like a small hill before it slides into the bowl. You set it across your left palm and give it a respectful look, the way you might look at a messenger who always arrives on time, says just enough, and leaves the room calmer than they found it. The cloth at your sash waits. You draw the fukusa free and allow it to unfold in the air like a falling leaf that has practiced falling for years. You fold it in your fingers 2, then 3 until its edge stands ready to meet the chashaku. The room attends without appearing to pay attention. The kettle speaks in its low voice. The bamboo fountain outside submits to gravity and then thinks again. You place the cloth against the scoop and begin to purify it, not because dirt threatens the tea, but because attention purifies the one who holds the tool. Here is the plain fact everyone repeats, even when no one asks. In formal preparation, the chashaku is ritually cleansed with the fukusa before it meets the tea caddy, whether that caddy is the small-lidded natsume for thin tea or the narrow-shouldered chair for the thick. This is not a flourish. It is the hinge upon which the next motions turn. Samurai learned that a hinge decides how a door feels. The chashaku's quiet wiping decides how the rest will feel too. If your mind is still catching up with your hands, the cloth will tell on you by hesitating where it should glide. You make a slow pass along the stem, then another along the underside of the scoop's lip, careful not to put pressure where pressure would warp the slender curve. The fukusa silk warms against your fingers. A whisper of woven sound rises and vanishes soft, then softer. You turn the scoop a breath, attending to the place where the bamboo node leaves its small dark knot. The knot is a reminder that the stalk once stood and caught light and rain without complaint. You do not need to think this thought, yet it obliges you anyway. A fringe habit comes to mind, as fringe habits like to do. Some hosts keep a tiny sliver of fragrant wood near the storage box so that, over months, the scoop takes on a breath of cedar or plum. The practice is quiet, and so are the scoops that carry it. A guest rarely remarks on scent, but the nose bows before the mind has time to categorize. You do not make a show of this. You would not mention it aloud any more than you would boast about trimming a fingernail without incident. You check the tip. It is the one part guests never touch. Everyone knows this, and yet the warning keeps getting written down as if new. The tip is where the tea rests. It is the mouth of a well nobody steps in. You pass the cloth along its edge once, no more, letting the silk remember the curve. If another had handled the scoop carelessly, you would feel it here in the faintest roughness, the ghost of an ill-timed scrape. Your scoop has no ghosts today. You let the cloth fold back upon itself, hiding whatever it has taken, which is mostly your attention. The chashaku bears a name written on the inner lid of its paulownia wood box, brushed by a former owner with care that might look like vanity to someone who has never loved a tool. Names have a way of collecting around tea, implements the way moss collects at the feet of stones. Evening reed, perhaps, or rainbend. The name changes nothing about the powder it will carry, yet it changes how your fingers meet the stem, how your breath meets the next motion. Gifts of named scoops pass between warriors and tea men, and sometimes a neatly tied silk cord did more to settle a matter than a chest of coin. You turn the scoop in your hand and watch light pick out its grain, pale then paler. The slight sheen where hands have passed it, again and again, is the kindest kind of polish earned by use, not by scrubbing. You set the fukusa aside and rest the scoop across the rim of the tea caddy for a heartbeat, measuring the courtesy between tools. The caddy receives the bamboo without complaint. The two look as if they have always shared this small span of space. Scholars still argue whether the precise wiping sequence you have just performed settled into its current form under the stern eye of the 16th century master, whose name has become a short road through long forests, or whether a later generation codified what had been local habits into something tidy enough to teach to strangers. The old diaries hint one way, the school manuals point another. You let the dispute drift by like smoke. Your hands know what to do, whether the argument ever ends or not. You pause long enough to feel your shoulders unclench and then move the chashaku toward the tea caddy. The lid lifts with a tiny sigh you pretend not to hear. Inside, the powder weights a green so deep and dull it almost reads as velvet in the low light. The scoop descends, takes up a modest hill, and rises without spilling a grain. You do not heap it like a boast. You give it the amount that asks for conversation rather than applause. A warrior who learns to measure tea without greed often finds his speech measuring itself the same way. The kettle murmurs a little lower, reminding you that heat keeps its own counsel. The whisk nearby stands patient, a small forest bound at the waist. Your scoop hovers above the bowl and lets the powder fall into the pale interior like the first snowfall in a courtyard. A brief hush, a small drift, a pause. You add a second measure, then a third, watching the color bloom against clay. If this were thick tea, a heavier growth of green would rise. For thin tea, modest hills suffice. Either way, the scoop keeps repeating its one quiet verb, carry. You return the chashaku to its place, not quite touching the mat, not quite touching the caddy, just so. Many hands have learned this exact distance, the way many feet have learned the length of a stride on gravel. The scoop looks unimportant now that it has laid down its burden, which is precisely the manner expected of a well-trained retainer. When called upon, it acts. When finished, it disappears from attention without sulking. Another tidbit wanders in, dressed as trivia but waving the same flag as etiquette. Some scoops were shaved from unusual pieces bamboo taken from the eaves of an old temple, or from a grove that survived a fire, or from a stalk struck by winter in a way that left the grain a shade darker. Owners favored such stories because stories teach the hand to be gentle. Whether the material changes the flavor is doubtful. Whether the story changes the handler is certain. You retrieve the fukusa once more and give the chashaku a final, courteous pass. Not for need, but for farewell. The cloth folds smaller and returns to your sash where its warmth returns to your side as if it never left. The scoop rests where a guest may admire it without feeling compelled to praise it aloud. Praise, in the room of tea, is like salt. A pinch steadies the flavor. A handful ruins the meal. With the bamboo set and the powder waiting, your hands come back to your knees. The etiquette the scoop teaches is plain and not at all simple. Touch lightly, name sparingly, return things exactly where they belong. You feel this settle into your fingers like a rule that was always there, merely waiting to be invited inside. Outside, a crow declares the entire operation beneath his notice. Inside, you allow yourself the smallest smile. You have cleaned a tool and cleaned your pace at the same time. The room approves by making no remark. You kneel before the alcove and let your eyes soften until the hanging scroll and empty space begin to agree with each other. The alcove is a small stage where nothing performs. You do not rush to fill it. The vase waits at the edge of sight, a narrow neck above a round belly, the clay dark and old enough to keep its stories to itself. The room's breath is cool here. The floor feels a shade firmer, as if the house has placed its weight politely on this spot so your hands will steady. You turn to the low tray where sprigs from the garden rest upon a damp cloth. Your fingers hover, not choosing yet. This is not the flower arranging of display halls and long tables. It is a quiet practice with a small name. Tea flowers, chosen to look as though they came in with the morning and would leave by dusk. A plain fact everyone repeats because it never grows old is that tea favors a single, seasonal stem or a modest pair, arranged to look unarranged, as if the garden leaned in to greet the guest and then thought better of staying. In such restraint, warriors learn to let the season speak for them. You lift a camellia bud not yet open, its green casing tight, a hint of color pressing through like the first syllable of a word. The leaves are glossy without shine, their edges clean. You touch the cut end to the bowl of water and watch the surface break and mend in a heartbeat. Beside it, a sprig of moss waits, darker than it appears in sun, smelling faintly of earth when your thumb brushes it. You also consider a sliver of pine, straight and frank, the needles answering the room with a whisper when you move them. You bring the empty vase closer and test its balance. It leans a breath to one side, which is not a problem but a possibility. The alcove's light has shifted since dawn. The scroll's ink looks cooler now, its strokes drawn with the kind of speed that is quieter than slowness. You place a small wedge inside the vase to guide the stems, a device so modest it is nearly an apology. The camellia enters first, slanting as if it has turned to watch the kettle thinking. The pine sets itself a little behind, an older brother pretending to stand casually while keeping the younger in view. The moss does not argue. It fills the low space with a softness that belongs to shade. You step back on your knees and look. The bud is too bold. You ease it lower, not by pushing the stem but by lifting the wedge and letting gravity remember its work. Now the bud appears to have found its own height. The arrangement is simple enough that you could take it apart and repeat it on another day, and still it would not be the same. The tea room is full of motions like this. The pattern repeats. The moment does not. A fringe habit, whispered rather than taught, has you wet a fingertip in clean water and touch it lightly to the bud's outer leaves. A single bead clings there, not a trick but a kindness, as if the garden had not been entirely left outside. Some hosts set the stems while they still hold dawn's dew. Others, when dawn has gone, lend a memory of it with a touch. If a guest notices, they do so inwardly. Praise, like fragrance, should not push. You look again at the line the stems make. Not a ladder, not a spear. The pine angles back, the camellia forward, the moss low, so that the eye moves from earth to youth to elder, and then returns to earth without being told to do so. This modest arithmetic of placements is older than most rules written in tidy lines. Historians still argue whether the deliberate plainness favored in tea flowers came directly from the hand of a renowned master in the age when war and refinement sat in the same room, or whether later schools read his attitude into every bud and branch. The diaries that survive say little, the arrangements that survive say nothing. The debate continues with courteous stamina. The mainstream fact sits nearby and nods. In this practice, blossoms too large or too fragrant are discouraged. A single bud or a small wildflower suits the room, while elaborate sprays belong somewhere else, where applause knows what to do with itself. Warriors who learned to choose a shy stem over a boastful bloom found it convenient, later, to prefer short speech over long. The tea room persuades without appearing to. You nudge the vase so the camellia does not stand perfectly centered beneath the scroll. Center is showy. A slight offset tells the eye to breathe. The scroll's characters seem to regard the bud with an elder's tolerant interest. If the scroll offers a seasonal phrase, it is brief enough to be mistaken for weather. You allow this imagined conversation to pass through your mind and leave no tracks. You check the mouth of the vase for stray drops and wipe them with a cloth whose edge knows how to pretend it never touched water. The glaze near the foot shows a pale run where heat once encouraged it to walk and then changed its mind. You set the vase down so the run looks accidental and inevitable at once. The camellia does not complain. The pine will keep watch without being thanked. A quiet tidbit rises, smiling to itself. Some hosts favor stems gathered not from the garden, but from a roadside ditch or a neglected corner, the kind of weed that seems immune to ceremony. It is not a rebellion. It is an embrace of the world as it is found. A single grass, given space, can tastefully rebuke abundance. Guests notice with their bodies before their minds collect words for it. The lesson is useful outside the room too. Sometimes the modest thing turns the mood more surely than the splendid thing. You settle your hands upon your knees and study the small shadows the leaves cast upon the alcove's plaster. They tremble when the kettle exhales. The harmony is not dramatic. It is a companionship of small breaths. If you had to speak aloud about it, the spell would thin. So you do not. A final adjustment. The bud tilted a hair, as if listening toward the entrance. The pine withdrew a finger's width. The moss, being practical, stays where it has been told and improves everything by doing nothing. The alcove feels finished in the way a sentence feels finished when the last word chooses not to be clever. You bow to the flowers, not deeply, but with the gratitude one gives to something that will not last. Tea has a way of teaching respect for brief appointments. Steam, froth, warmth, bloom. The etiquette that arises from this is the etiquette of disappearing well. A warrior who learns to honor a bud that has not yet opened is not likely to applaud his own arrival in any room. You ease backward and let the alcove re-enter the larger stillness of the tea room. The kettle goes on speaking in its steady pine breath voice. Outside, a dragonfly zips once past the paper wall and forgets you exist. Inside, the flower forgets itself, which is exactly what you hoped. The room seems larger by the exact size of your restraint. You do not ask the arrangement to be perfect. You ask it to be ready. And it is. The bud will consider opening. The pine will not age at all in the hours to come. The moss will keep the secret of its fragrance the way a messenger keeps a sealed letter. Your task here is finished, which means the room will now do the real work and make everyone quieter than they plan to be. You bring the bowl nearer, and the powder waits inside like a small green hill that does not plan to move unless invited. The kettle's voice lowers as if it knows it is about to be called upon. You reach for the whisk. It stands in its own small posture, a crown of fine tines bound at the waist, bamboo made into a soft forest by a knife and patient hands. You cradle it with both palms for a breath, the way a host might greet a shy guest before showing them to their seat. The whisk is light. Its balance promises work without strain. You tip the ladle and allow a modest ribbon of hot water to fall into the bowl. Not boiling, never that, but lively, like a visitor who knows to speak in a pleasant murmur rather than a shout. The powder darkens at the edges and begins to melt into the warmth with the manners of someone who saw the invitation coming. A second ribbon follows the first. You set the ladle back where it belongs, as if returning a child to a cushion. The bowl's scent rises, green, deep, with a faint sweetness that hides behind a stern expression. You set the whisk into the pool and let the tines kiss the bottom once, twice, to anchor your pace. Then you begin. The motion is not round. It is quick and straight, back and forth. A brush painting the character for breath over and over without ink. When done with care, the powder and water stop arguing and agree to become a single thing. A plain fact every school repeats without blushing. For a thin preparation, brisk strokes in a shallow layer bring the froth. For a thick preparation, the whisk lifts and folds more than it beats, respecting a strength that will never froth and shouldn't try. The bowl tells you which road you are on before you have walked very far. Your wrist does not announce itself. It simply learns the room's rhythm and follows. The foam, should this be a frothing kind of moment, arrives first at the edges, then gathers courage and moves toward the center. Tiny bubbles, even and fine, prefer a whisk that has been trained by repetition rather than by ambition. You keep the whisk near the surface where the air is waiting, then dip slightly and let the deeper color return, then rise again. The sound is a quick, dry whisper. Bamboo over clay, soft and confident. A hush that repeats until it almost stops being a sound and becomes a feeling behind the ears. A modest wave forms, then smooths. The surface brightens, not with glare, but with the kind of lively sheen seen on leaves after gentle rain. Your shoulders consider tensing and are discouraged by the bowl's steadiness. The tea thickens, as if deciding, all at once, that it was silly to sulk as powder, and will now behave as drink. You finish with a small flourish that is not really a flourish. A slight lift and circle to tidy the surface. A tremor, less pause. A retreat to the side. The whisk leaves the foam as level as a pond that has just discovered it, cannot be bothered by wind. You raise the whisk and regard its tines. They hold drops that look like beads threaded on gold. Except there is no gold. Only bamboo that has learned to carry water without complaint. A quirky habit whispers at the edge of old notes. Some hosts quietly count how many gatherings a whisk has served, notching it in memory rather than on wood. A whisk past its prime shows it at the tips, which soften and flower. Some keep such elder tools for colder days, when a gentler touch makes kinder foam. Others retire them to the shelf where old implements sit like veterans who still arrive early and give advice by saying nothing. You tap the whisk lightly against the bowl's inner curve once, not twice, to return what can be returned. The etiquette is simple. Do not waste effort. Do not waste flavor. Do not waste motion. Samurai learned this here because tea insisted on it. A warrior able to make 100 fast strokes without splashing learned a language the battlefield could not teach, the quiet speed that does not call attention to itself. A mainstream truth sits on the shelf like a jar that has been opened many times. Whisks of this kind are cut from a single stalk, split into dozens of tines by hands that know exactly how thin a line can be before it forgets it is a line. Some regions earned a long reputation for this work, sending boxes of pale, fragrant tools to houses far from their own. They arrived bound with plain cords, accompanied by brief notes that used as few words as possible and still said everything necessary. You rinse the whisk with a breath of hot water and watch the drops run clear. The bowl now holds a surface like young jade, more inviting than fierce, though it will bite a little if you rush it. You rotate the bowl a finger's width to invite a better view of the color, a courtesy to the eye that costs nothing. The foam keeps its shape with the pride of a small task done well. Scholars still argue whether this love of fine froth came first from courtly tastes, or from the stern call of wabi that arrived later like winter, shifting eyes toward quiet textures and away from polished gleam. Some writings praise a thick, unfrothing strength as the truest expression. Others lift the lively foam like morning light. The debate is patient, and will likely outlive your whisk. You are not obliged to settle it. You are obliged to read the room and whisk accordingly. You leave the whisk to rest for a moment upon its handle, tines lifted, so they will not remember the bowl's curve too much and grow crooked. A small drop clings and refuses to fall. You respect its stubbornness and let it keep its high place until it chooses otherwise. The kettle breathes. The bamboo fountain knocks again in the garden, somehow surprised every time it does so. You settle your hands on your knees and let your pulse copy the kettle's pace. Another small tidbit steps to the doorway and bows. Some hosts once trimmed their whisk tips by a hair's width to tune the sound and feel. A quiet adjustment almost no guest could see, but many could sense without knowing why. Others favored thicker tines in winter for a more dignified texture, and finer in spring for a brightness that suited young leaves and early light. Whether these preferences change flavor or simply change the handler is the sort of question that keeps long evenings comfortable. You turn the bowl so that its front faces away from you, a small humility taught to hands before it is taught to minds. The surface shines without showing off. The foam holds little peaks that pretend not to be peaks, the kind that vanish as soon as anyone decides to admire them. This restraint is the ceremony's favorite costume. It fits every season, every rank, every quarrel left outside the door. You lift the whisk once more, give the surface a last tender smoothing, a gesture like laying a blanket on a sleeping child, and then set the tool aside, angled so a guest may admire it if they wish, or ignore it if they need their quiet more than their curiosity. The bowl waits. The tea has learned its manners. If it had a voice, it would speak softly and say only what was needed. You do not drink yet. You allow a few breaths to pass so the bowl's warmth can settle into your palms, so the scent can find the corners of the room, so a warrior's spine can remember what straightness feels like when it isn't showing off. The ceremony will move on at the speed of breath. You have whisked the green hill into a green lake, and the lake is glass. It will not stay that way for long. The moment is to be used now, without hurry. The kettle agrees by saying nothing at all. You hear the faint scrape of knees on tatami before you see him. A fellow samurai enters through the low door, his head and shoulders bowing without argument to the lintel. The armor is not with him today. Instead, his robe hangs straight and unhurried, sleeves gathered neatly so they will not spill into the work of others. His swords are left outside, as the room insists. Here, rank is not announced by steel, but by the way one lowers the eyes and the spine. You return his bow, measuring the depth so it matches the distance between you. This is not mathematics, though it is precise. The etiquette is clear. Too shallow, and you imply carelessness. Too deep, and you risk turning courtesy into theater. In tea, balance is everything. A mainstream fact says what every guest knows bows here are not greetings alone. They are part of the structure that keeps the room's calm from collapsing under the weight of human pride. Warriors learn to set that pride down in the bow's arc and leave it there until the gathering's end. He moves to the guest's place and folds himself into the seiza position without a sound sharper than the kettle's breath. You notice his eyes take in the alcove, the hanging scroll, the quiet flower. In the order tradition prescribes, first the words, then the living, then the implements. It is not just habit, it is the agreed upon dance. Even a man who has stood in the field with banners whipping at his ears can find himself guided by this small choreography. As though the room itself were taking his shoulders and turning them gently toward the right view, your gaze meets his briefly before you both lower it again. Conversation is not forbidden, but it is rationed as carefully as charcoal. You allow a small exchange about the morning's wind, a remark about the camellia bud's hesitation to open. The weather is safe ground, and the flower is a shared witness. Beyond these, the air prefers not to be cut into pieces. He sets his fan beside him, the way men here have done for longer than anyone can remember. A gesture older than the silk and bamboo from which the fan is made. Scholars still argue whether the precise placement parallel to the knees, pointing inward, originated as a signal of disarmament among warriors or as a simple matter of convenience. Some say it was once the barrier across which no hand should reach. Others say it merely kept the silk from wrinkling under a careless heel. Neither story harms the fan's quiet authority. The kettle murmurs between you like a third participant whose words are perfectly timed and never excessive. Your guest notices the chosen bowl, its glaze soft in the lamplight. He does not remark upon it yet. Etiquette waits for the host's invitation before turning the bowl into a subject. His hands rest lightly on his thighs, fingers close but not locked, knuckles neither bent nor straight, a position that takes more discipline than most sword grips. A fringe tidbit drifts through memory. Some hosts deliberately seat higher-ranking guests slightly off-center to the kettle, not to slight them but to avoid overbathing them in heat or steam. In a world where war taught men to read every seating choice for hidden meaning, this gentle practicality could save a morning from needless suspicion. Today, your guest's position is ideal, neither favored nor ignored. You pour a small ladleful of hot water into the bowl to wake the tea's surface again, the steam rising between you like a curtain that quickly dissolves. His eyes follow the motion, not your face. This is how one learns. By watching the angle of the wrist, the settling of the sleeve, the exact point where ladle meets rim. Many warriors came here not for tea alone, but for these refinements, which could be carried back to the world outside, like a concealed blade made of manners. You turn the bowl a quarter turn before setting it down near his hands, careful to present the front toward him. The movement is neither slow nor fast. It exists in that narrow space where the mind forgets to measure. He bows once before accepting, his fingertips meeting the mat before they meet the bowl. The gesture is brief, as if to remind you that gratitude need not be dramatic to be complete. Historians still argue whether the unspoken rivalry between some guests played out in the tiniest of such exchanges. One bow a fraction deeper, one pause a breath longer, as a way to measure each other's command of subtlety. Tea records are too polite to name names, but the silences are sometimes thick enough to suggest what the ink withholds. You watch as he lifts the bowl with both hands, the left palm supporting the base, the right holding the side. The rotation comes next one quarter turn, so the front faces away before the first sip. It is a shared language that needs no explanation, a way of showing respect to the maker and to the object itself. He does it without glancing at you, which means he has been here often enough to know the lines of the play. While he drinks, you let your eyes rest on the flower arrangement in the alcove, not to inspect your own work, but to give him the courtesy of space. The sound of his sip is almost nothing. The tea room likes it that way. He lowers the bowl, turns it back, and places it on the mat so gently that the clay and reed barely acknowledge each other. Your eyes meet again for a moment, and there is a mutual bow, small but complete. No words are added. The steam curls between you and drifts toward the paper screens, where it fades into the white. Outside, a breeze stirs the pine shadows against the shoji. Inside, the air is still, except for the faint shift of your sleeves as you return your hands to your thighs. The guest's posture is as it was when he entered, except now his eyes carry the mild shine of someone who has set down more than an empty bowl. In this room, you think, every meeting is the meeting after the last meeting. The gestures repeat, the tools repeat, the bows repeat, but the man across from you will not be exactly this man again, not even if you invite him tomorrow. The ceremony makes its shape, and the samurai inside it learns, without being told, that shape is the only armor worth wearing here. You reach for the bowl again, your palms open and slow, as though approaching a creature that dislikes sudden movement. The clay is still warm from your guest's hands, a trace of his presence that will vanish soon enough. You lift it from the mat and cradle it just above your knees, letting the space between you and the guest become a small bridge that is neither hurried nor hesitant. Passing the tea is never just about transfer, a plain fact repeated in every school until even the walls of the tea room seem to know it is that the act of offering is as important as the tea itself. The bowl travels with two hands, the left supporting, the right steadying, elbows drawn slightly in, so the gesture feels contained rather than sprawling. Samurai trained here learned that the same measured offering could pass a cup or a treaty without changing its shape. You lean forward a fraction, bowing as you extend the bowl. The rim points toward your guest's right hand, the side turns so the front of the bowl meets him without obstacle. The front is not marked with words, only with the subtle agreement of tradition, a glaze pattern, a maker's mark, a place where the curve seems to pause. Your guest's hands meet yours without touching them, the bowl passing between you like a word whispered into the space between breaths. The etiquette is unspoken. Do not let fingers brush. Do not let the transfer become about touch instead of the object. In the pause before he draws the bowl toward himself, your eyes lower in acknowledgement. Historians still argue whether this manner of two-handed offering evolved purely within the tea room or was shaped by earlier court customs brought in by nobles who found their way to the kettle. Some claim it softened the warrior's grip, teaching those accustomed to holding weapons that a bowl must be carried without threat. Others suggest it simply prevented mishap after all. Dropping a guest's bowl would collapse more than the mood. As your guest receives the bowl, you draw your hands back slowly, palms brushing the tops of your thighs before resting flat. Your knees remain anchored. Movement in the tea room is always rooted, never drifting. You watch only long enough to ensure the transfer is complete, then lower your gaze so the act of drinking is private, even if it happens in front of you. A fringe tidbit lingers from an older host's voice. Some men, when passing a bowl to an elder or lord, would subtly adjust their breathing so that the exhale coincided with the offering. The rhythm made the hands steadier and gave the moment an invisible seam, binding giver and receiver for the briefest instant. The guest might not notice, but the host's pulse would. Your guest bows slightly before lifting the bowl to his lips. He drinks with the careful attention he prefers no slurping here, though in other contexts the sound might be welcomed as appreciation. Here, silence is the applause. The green surface lowers with each sip, the foam clinging to the rim in a narrow band before sliding down into the bowl's curve. You take note of how he rotates the bowl again before setting it down, returning the front to its rightful place facing you. This is not required by law, but it is required by the quiet contract that governs the room. Such small reciprocations keep the ceremony from becoming one-sided, and samurai who learned this often carried the habit into every exchange, knowing where to give back what was lent. The bowl rests again on the mat between you. You extend your hands, but not before meeting his eyes briefly, to request permission without words. He inclines his head in assent. You retrieve the bowl and draw it back to your side, holding it in a way that neither flaunts nor hides its emptiness. The tea is gone, but the warmth remains, a ghost that lingers for a few more breaths before dispersing. A mainstream fact notes that in formal gatherings, a guest might be offered multiple servings, each with its own rhythm and small shifts in handling. Today is not such a day. One bowl will suffice. The value here is not in repetition, but in the weight of a single, shared act done without flaw. Even one perfect pass can hold the same dignity as a long conversation, and perhaps more truth. You set the bowl slightly aside, ready for rinsing when the moment comes, and return your hands to rest upon your thighs. The space between you and the guest is once again just space, not a bridge, not a path. The kettle's murmur returns to fill it, steady and impartial. The guest inclines his head in gratitude, and you return the bow at a matching depth. Neither of you speaks. There is nothing to add that the passing of the bowl has not already said. The silence after such an exchange is not emptiness. It is the echo of something finished properly. Outside, the breeze has found the pine again, and its needles stir against the white paper wall in slow shapes. Inside, the air settles. The room does not keep score, but it remembers the way you carried the bowl and the way he received it, just as it remembers the steps of every pair who have met here before. The bowl, empty now, holds no less importance than when it was full. A samurai leaving the room may carry the lesson with him without realizing that the act of giving is not complete when the object leaves your hands, but when it is returned to stillness with grace. This truth is small enough to fit in a tea bowl, and large enough to shape the way a man sits in any room thereafter. You settle back into the quiet, letting the rhythm of breath take the lead. The bowl rests at your side, empty now, but still carrying the faint scent of green, a fragrance that will fade before the next task. Your guest's posture has not changed. His spine is still straight, his hands folded lightly, his gaze lowered in that polite half-attention reserved for the moments between exchanges. It is your turn now, not to serve, but to receive. In some gatherings, the host takes tea alongside the guest not out of thirst, but to share the moment without the formality of roles pressing too tightly. A mainstream fact that even the most casual student knows. In the most orthodox schools, this sipping by the host is never a performance. It is done with the same careful etiquette as serving. but without any of the weight that makes the guest feel examined. You lift your own bowl from the mat, smaller than the one you offered, its glaze a muted gray with faint iron speckles where the fire once drew near. You have used it often. Your hands know its weight before they close around it. The warmth is even, neither scalding nor tepid. You turn it slightly so that its front looks away from you, as courtesy demands. Even though the only witness is the man seated across the tatami, the steam rises and curls toward your face, carrying a green scent that reminds you of damp moss and freshly split bamboo. You pause with the rim just below your lips, not for effect, but to let the aroma gather. The first sip is slow. The foam brushes your upper lip without clinging, the flavor holding both bitterness and sweetness at once. Two opponents that have agreed to share the mat. The liquid moves warm down your throat, and you feel your shoulders drop the way soldiers drop their gear after a march. A fringe tidbit lives here. Though few say it aloud, some samurai would judge a host's character by watching the way he drank his own tea. Too eager, and the host was thought impatient. Too slow, and he was suspected of vanity. The middle pace, steady and without self-consciousness, was seen as the mark of a man whose discipline reached beyond the tea room. Whether this habit of judgment was fair is another matter entirely. You take a second sip, holding the bowl with both hands, so that the base rests gently on your left palm. Your right fingers curve along the side, not gripping, but keeping the vessel steady. The warmth spreads into your skin, a reminder that part of the ceremony's lesson is physical. You cannot drink tea without touching something directly, and you cannot touch without leaving some trace of yourself. The room offers no sound except the kettle's steady murmur and the occasional shift of your guest's sleeve as he adjusts his posture. The quiet is not empty, it is layered with every small thing that is not said. You finish the last sip, tilting the bowl just enough to take in all the liquid without straining. Then you rotate it back, returning the front to its proper place. Historians still argue whether the careful rotation before and after drinking developed purely from aesthetics, avoiding wear on a single point of the rim, or whether it began as an act of reverence toward the bowl's maker. Records suggest both are true, but the tea room rarely cares for exact origins. It cares for the continuity of the gesture and how it feels in the hand. You lower the bowl to the mat with a sound so faint that only the tatami hears it. Your right hand leaves the side first, then your left withdraws from beneath. You bow your head slightly toward the vessel, not in worship, but in thanks. The warmth still lingers in your palms for several breaths afterward, and you allow it to fade before moving on. Your guest is watched without intruding, his gaze steady but soft. You meet his eyes briefly, and there is a mutual acknowledgement. No smile, no nod, just the brief meeting of attention before you both return to the quiet. The tea has done its work. It will not be repeated today, but its calm will remain like a scent that clings to the sleeves long after the smoke is gone. A mainstream fact circles back here. Tea in this form was never meant to fill the belly. Its strength lies in the pause it requires, the narrowing of the world to a bowl, a breath, a shared moment that refuses to be rushed. Samurai carried this pause with them into councils and camps, where a heartbeat of silence could be more valuable than 100 shouted orders. You place the bowl aside for rinsing, not immediately, but when the next flow of the gathering permits. The kettle continues its quiet work, steam escaping in small, unhurried streams. Outside, a pine branch shifts against the wall, and a single petal from the camellia bud falls not open, but folded, as if it had decided to keep its secrets for another day. The room receives this without comment. So do you. In tea, as in war, not every movement demands an answer. You let the room shrink to the scale of hands and tools. The broad matters of the world rest outside the fence. Within, the names are small and sufficient. You draw the whisk nearer, not to use it, but to see it. The bamboo is pale as winter straw. The tines a forest of even lines, their tips slightly curled from steam and service. When you turn it in your fingers, light walks along the grain, and then vanishes where the maker's knife once paused. The handle bears no mark, yet your palm knows where it wants to settle, the way a bird knows its favorite branch without counting leaves. The whisk returns to its place, and your eyes travel to the ladle. Its bowl is shallow, a half moon of wood that remembers water even when dry, The handle stretches long and straight, so distance can be measured without standing. You tilt it once, listening for any complaint from the joint where handle meets bowl. There is none. It answers with silence, which is the only report tea admires. A plain fact everyone learns early. The long-handled ladle governs temperature and portion as surely as the kettle governs sound. Its angle decides whether the water arrives playful or calm. Samurai discovered that such control, this little sovereignty of the wrist, could be carried into other rooms without anyone noticing until a quarrel ended before it began. You rest your gaze on the object that serves as a small pillow for the ladle's lid when it is set aside, the support that keeps hot from touching cool, edge from striking edge. Sometimes it is cut from a segment of green bamboo, sometimes turned from a quiet piece of wood, sometimes formed in clay, so modest it would rather be mistaken for a stone. You set the kettle's lid there for a breath and study the way metal and plant agree to keep each other safe. Historians still argue whether the earliest supports were improvised from whatever was nearest twig, horn, shell, or whether a particular form was always intended. The record is generous with praise and stingy with details, which is its favorite habit. You open the wastewater bowl and regard its emptiness with the courtesy due a useful servant between tasks. The inside gleams with the kind of cleanliness that is more about repetition than scrubbing. You pour a little cooling water in, then pour it out, not because the bowl asked, but because habit keeps the road smooth. The sound is brief, a soft consonant in the room's long vowel. Now the tea caddy waits under your hand. If it is day for a lacquered one, you lift its lid and see the sheen that seems to be made of nighttime. If it is day for a narrower jar of fired clay, you find the warm roughness near the shoulders where hands once turned it on a wheel. Either way, you have learned to see the caddy as a quiet gatekeeper. It keeps the powder safe from air, from damp, from haste. A mainstream fact, written and taught until no one dares forget it. Powder kept dry and cool, guarded by good box and better habit, returns kindness with clean flavor. Neglect repays in bitterness, which tea neither forgives nor hides. You draw the scoop across the caddy's mouth without touching it, a courtesy to both wood and powder. Then lay the scoop where the guest may admire its curve without feeling obliged to praise it aloud. A small, odd tidbit remains from an elder's story. Some scoops were shaved from bamboo taken from the shaded edge of temple eaves, where rain and time taught the fibers patience. Others were cut from arrow shafts retired from service, as if to persuade a warrior's hand that speed could become precision. Whether such material changes taste is doubtful. Whether it changes the handler is nearly certain. The bowl sits near the hearth, the clay holding the day's warmth like a memory cupped in palms. You run a thumb along the foot ring and feel the bare earth where glaze did not travel. A hair-thin line trails through that unglazed circle, the kind of firing mark that potters accept the way farmers accept weather. You incline the bowl a little and find the place the maker meant to be the front. Not a shout, only a slight pause in the curve, or a pattern where ash decided to linger. Historians still argue whether some famous bowls' designated fronts are original or the invention of a later admirer whose preference hardened into rule. It is the sort of debate that keeps old storage boxes warm in winter. You lift the kettle's lid with the iron hook, a small tool with a manner older than lacquer, and watch the steam unroll like a banner with no emblem. The hook returns to its corner, and the lid returns to its pillow. The path of each object is as mapped as a town's lanes, and as forgiving when traveled with care. The iron rim glows damp where the steam has touched. A single bead forms and falls, a tiny, polite departure. Your attention returns to cloth. The white wiping cloth waits folded with the humility of linen. The silk cloth rests with the quiet pride of something that remembers ceremonies grander than today's. When you use them, the hands behave differently without being told. The practical cotton invites work. The silk invites pause. A plain fact sits in every manual. One cloth cleans, one purifies, and confusing the two is not a sin, but a sign the mind is elsewhere. Samurai who trained the difference into their fingers discovered the same difference in talk: what is needed, what is refined, and when each belongs. You survey the flower shears lying beside the vase, a little intruder from the garden world, its edges wrapped in cloth so steel will not scratch clay. You need it for nothing now. yet you're glad to see it obeying the rule of quiet edges. The presence of a tool not in use reminds you of another fringe habit. Some hosts place a single gray feather near the alcove to lift a dust mote from a scroll without smudging ink. Guests rarely see it. When they do, they understand that readiness in tea looks like gentleness, not like parade. The box that keeps the caddy when the room is empty sits open to one side, its inner lid inked with brisk characters. A name that might be the object's, might be a former owner's, might be wishful thinking bound in string. You fit the lid on for a heartbeat, then lift it away again, answering the wood with a nod only your fingertips can see. Scholars still argue which inscriptions are true and which were added by merchants with fertile imaginations and a need to please wealthy eyes. The implements endure these debates the way rocks endure weather, by doing nothing about them. Your guest watches with the kind of attention that is light enough not to bruise. You tilt the whisk, see that every tine remains even, then set it upright so drying will not teach it a crooked lesson. The ladle's bowl faces down to discourage drifting ash. The hook's curve points away from sleeves and temptation. The caddy's lid rests with its seam aligned to a line in the mat, a small geometry that pleases the eye without informing the tongue. A last, ordinary truth, mainstream, enough to be boring and therefore reliable, reminds you that each tool owns a home in the layout, and returning it there is not an obsession, but a kindness. The tea room teaches that losing objects begins with losing attention, and that the first step toward respect is remembering where things belong. The larger world pretends to be different. It is not. You look once around the circle of implements and feel the same quiet recognition a commander might feel when his men have taken their places and need no signal to hold them. Tea arranges bodies and tools until they can keep their own order. When the order holds, speech is unnecessary. When it fails, speech arrives too late. Your hands rest on your thighs again. The kettle murmurs its low agreement. Outside, a breeze gathers itself and then changes its mind, rustling the bamboo without moving the branches. Inside, the utensils glow with the small dignity of things that asked for little and were given care. You admire them one more breath, not to adore, but to acknowledge. Then you let your gaze soften and step back into the wider stillness the room provides. Tools that are respected disappear. Tools that clamor for praise do not belong here. Today, everything that belongs is present and behaving, which is the highest compliment a tea gathering knows how to give. You let speech arrive the way steam does, thin at first, then just enough to remind the room that breath becomes weather when it leaves the mouth. The guest glances toward the alcove as if asking permission from the brushstrokes before he opens his lips. You nod the smallest nod, the kind that grants a lane but not a parade. The season will do the talking for you both. You are merely here to keep it from wandering into places where it will knock things over. You offer the first line because etiquette likes the host to set the height of the fence. The wind turns leaves before noon, you say, a remark that claims nothing and notices everything. He answers with a similar modesty. The pond keeps the sun to itself, and the two of you have made a path. Short phrases, light steps. Tea prefers this manner conversation that acknowledges the day and the simple things in it. A mainstream fact sits comfortably here. In formal gatherings, talk is restrained and seasonal, circling the weather, the flower, the utensils, the journey taken to arrive, and little else. Politics and quarrels are told to wait outside with the swords, and they obey if they know what is good for them. Your eyes drift to the pine sprig behind the camellia bud. The needles are still as painted lines. You mention how the earlier rain left the clay garden path dark enough that the stepping stones looked like islands. Your guest agrees and adds a detail about a spider's web along the fence, strung with beads like a necklace for someone who would never wear one. The details accumulate without rivalry, as pebbles do beside a stream. The kettle agrees in its low voice. You speak of cold mornings that trick the plum into thinking it is time. He tells you the mountain beyond the fields swallowed the moon whole last night, and then mislaid it. These are not performances. They are the kind of small, obedient observations that keep pride from slipping through the door and making a spectacle of itself. Samurai who practice this style of speech learn that brevity can be more commanding than a speech stacked with banners and drums. A fringe tidbit steps in from an elder's notebook. Some hosts favored a tiny season, word tucked into a sentence, the way poets tuck a small leaf into a longer verse. Moon, drizzle, first frost, early cicada. Not full poetry, not a contest, just a borrowed habit that trained the tongue to taste the time of year without gnawing on it. Guests who caught the word bowed inwardly. Those who missed it still found their breath slowing to match the room. You turn the bowl, you will rinse in a few moments so the light catches its soft glaze. Your guest remarks, quietly, that the clay's tone suits days when the air cannot decide if it is warm or cool. He is not asking the bowl to be praised. He is letting the weather speak through it. You answer by naming the hillside where the clay might have been dug, not as fact, but as possibility. Historians still argue whether a celebrated lineage of bowls always came from one family's earth or whether commerce and clever storytelling braided several kilns into a single legend. The boxes insist one thing. The shards exhumed from old refuse pits sometimes suggest another. You do not bring the shards into the room. You let the questions sit politely. A guest with folded hands. Your guest mentions travel the road was muddy near the willow grove, and a farmer's cart waited so long at the ford that it forgot to complain. Travel talk is permitted because roads are merely whether you walk on. You reply that the bamboo grove murmured at dawn, a wind with no temper. Then you both let the quiet lift its head again and look around, as if to check that it is still in charge. You feel the old caution rise. Talk should not admire itself. The tea room is allergic to cleverness that knows it is clever. You sand down your next sentence until it is smooth enough to pass a fingertip without snagging. The camellia is thinking, you say, glancing at the tight bud. He nods as if the flower's deliberations were as important as any map. In this way, etiquette escorts humility to a seat where it can eat in peace. Your hands fold the rinsing cloth once in your lap. The cloth speaks for you. Not yet, it says about the work to come. You mention the kettle's voice. Lower now than at dawn, closer to late afternoon, even though the sun has only just climbed into a tolerable mood. Your guest answers that the bamboo fountain outside has taken to pausing longer between its boughs, as if considering retirement. You both accept the little personifications because they keep the world gentle. A mainstream truth returns, unembarrassed by its own simplicity. In these meetings, the host and guest admire the implements briefly, not as objects to be collected, but as participants in the season. The whisk belongs to mist. The charcoal belongs to winter hands. The thin tea, today, belongs to a morning that has decided not to rush. None of this needs to be said aloud, so you don't say it. The room hears anyway. Another small, odd story arrives with a polite cough. It is said that one master, tickled by a guest who could not stop boasting of battle, changed the topic by pointing to a single ant on the hearth's edge and praising its steady courage in heat. The guest fell quiet without losing face. Whether this happened once or a dozen times, the tale is traded like a good ladle, useful, unflashy, impossible to dislike. You skirt around the forbidden thickets with ease. You do not speak names of lords or rumors of levies. You do not measure borders or count grievances. If news exists, it exists beyond the hedge. Inside, there is only steam and leaf and the soft minutes that gather in corners and pretend not to be precious. Historians still argue whether this restraint truly softened warrior culture or merely gave it a room where softness could stretch its legs without being mocked. The record shows men who killed neatly and knelt neatly. Which came first refuses to stand where scholars can see it. Your guest's fan shifts on the mat to follow his knees as he resettles. You remark that the ink on the scroll looks freshly wet when the light falls a certain way. He answers that the brush's final stroke lifts like a swallow's tail. Neither of you pronounce the word on the paper. The meaning is not a puzzle to solve. It is a shape to breathe beside. Conversation narrows further, like a stream approaching a quiet pond. You share a memory of last year's first snow, how it erased the garden's careful lines until only the stone basin and the lantern kept their shapes. He replies with a memory of early summer, when the same basin held stars that would not stand still. The two seasons take turns at the doorway, exchange bows, and depart. The room remains exactly as it was, and more itself than before. You allow silence to land and stay. The kettle exhales. The camellia does not open. The pine keeps its counsel. You and your guest rest in the kind of shared quiet that needs no mending. Words have done the light work required of them and are excused. The tea room prefers it this way. Speech as a guest, not a host. Season as the head of the household. You nod once, enough to say, "Now we return to our hands." He nods in answer, enough to say, "The weather has said what we needed to hear." The ceremony moves on, carrying with it the lesson it never tires of teaching, that a few careful words can be braver than many. You watch the guest's eyes return to the alcove, drawn by the brushstrokes on the hanging scroll. It hangs without frame, the silk edges barely moving in the faint draft that seeps through the shoji. The ink is dark but not quite black, softened by age, the way old charcoal loses its bite but keeps its shape. The strokes themselves are quick and deliberate, a handful of lines that refuse to explain themselves. You shift your position slightly so that you, too, can take in the scroll from the proper angle. In tea, looking at a scroll is not a casual glance. It is an act with its own posture. The knees stay planted, the spine stays straight, and the eyes read not just the characters, but the space around them. A mainstream fact that even novice guests learn quickly. The scroll sets the tone of the gathering, whether through a Zen phrase, a poem, or a single character. It is chosen for the season, the occasion, or the company, sometimes all three, and is meant to guide the heart as much as the mind. This one carries 3 characters. You do not say them aloud. To name them would make the scroll about you instead of about the moment. You simply let your gaze travel from the first stroke, bold and long, to the last, which tapers as if deciding it has said enough. Your guest, watching you, follows the same path. In this mirrored attention lies part of the etiquette, looking together without needing to agree. A fringe tidbit drifts in, remembered from an older host's story. Sometimes the scroll was hung not for its words, but for the calligrapher's hand. Warriors with a taste for such things could recognize the brushwork of a famed monk or a retired general, and the knowledge was a quiet badge of cultivation. Others, less versed, simply admired the ink's weight and the paper's aging, never knowing the hand that made them. Both responses were acceptable, as long as they were sincere. The scroll's paper has faint fibers running through it like pale roots, reminders of the mulberry plant from which it was born. Near the bottom edge, a small watermark blooms, perhaps a result of the mounting process, perhaps an accident that the mounter decided was charming enough to keep. Historians still argue whether such marks were sometimes deliberate, a kind of maker's signature, or whether they were simply tolerated imperfections that later collectors romanticized. Either way, the scroll wears it without apology. You remark softly that the characters seem lighter on the left than the right, as if the brush had breathed out in the final moments. Your guest nods, adding that the ink feels as though it were laid down in one morning, without correction. Neither of you claims to know for sure. It is the not knowing that keeps the object alive. The alcove is small, but the scroll commands it without crowding the flower below. The camellia's closed bud leans just enough to suggest conversation between bloom and brushstroke. You have seen gatherings where the two seem to ignore each other entirely, and others where they seem too eager to match. Here, there is balance, no competition, no hierarchy, just coexistence. You glance at the rod along the scroll's bottom edge. The lacquer is worn smooth where hands have rolled and unrolled it over the years. The cord that binds it when stored is a muted brown. It's not so precise that it could only have been tied by someone who knew the value of tension without strain. You picture the scroll being taken from its paulownia wood box, unrolled on a low table, examined in the dim light of dawn to see if its mood suited the day. A mainstream truth returns to mind. The choice of scroll can be a subtle message to the guest, an encouragement, a reminder, or an offering of peace. Samurai who understood this could read between the brushstrokes as easily as they could read a battlefield. Those who did not simply enjoyed the sight of ink on paper and left the deeper meanings alone. Both approaches have their place. Your guest leans back slightly, signaling that his attention has shifted from the scroll to the room again. You follow, letting the alcove resume its quiet duty. The kettle murmurs behind you, and the faint scent of steamed bamboo rises from the whisk drying on its stand. A small, almost throwaway tidbit lingers from some teachers' lips. In certain circles, the scroll would be replaced midway through a day-long gathering, marking the change from formal to more relaxed atmosphere. Guests who noticed were free to take it as a sign. Guests who didn't were free to enjoy their tea without realizing the tone had shifted. The best hosts, it is said, chose scrolls for such moments that could be read both as greeting and as farewell. You let your gaze soften and return to your guest. Neither of you mentions the scroll again. It will stay until the gathering ends, keeping its counsel, as much a part of the meeting as the tea, the bowl, and the silence between words. In the tea room, nothing that stays still is ever truly idle. The kettle's voice has lowered, no longer the bright whisper of early heat, but the steady murmur of water that knows its work is almost done. You tilt your head slightly, letting the sound fill the room's remaining corners. In tea, even the kettle speaks in etiquette, its pace guiding the hands without calling attention to itself. You rest your palms briefly on your knees before leaning forward to draw another small ladleful of water. The movement is unhurried, each stage pausing just long enough to be noticed, but not so long that it feels like display. You pour the water into the bowl used earlier, letting it rinse away the faint green clinging to the sides. The sound is soft and hollow, water meeting clay, like two old friends exchanging short greeting. A mainstream fact every host learns early: rinsing the bowl in the guest's presence is not merely about cleanliness. It is a way to honor the object, to acknowledge its service before returning it to rest. Samurai took this same courtesy into other domains, treating even a worn piece of armor or an old weapon with respect when its duty was done. You tip the bowl slightly, letting the water swirl, then pour it into the wastewater vessel. The movement is contained, careful not to splash. A fringe tidbit comes to mind, half story and half habit. Some older hosts say the swirl in the rinse should echo the whisking pattern used earlier, a subtle rhyme between acts. Whether anyone else notices it hardly matters. It is the doing that counts. Setting the bowl back on the mat, you take up the white cloth. Its cotton is soft from repeated washing, its edges faintly frayed but still even. You wipe the inside of the bowl in slow arcs, folding the cloth over itself to hide the dampness each time. The clay cools under your touch, losing the warmth of tea, but gaining the calm of being tended. Historians still argue whether this slow cleaning ritual began purely for practical reasons, ensuring no grain of powder soured between gatherings, or whether it was always meant to be a closing gesture, a way of sealing the memory of the meeting into the utensil. The written records are split, and neither side seems in a hurry to win. Once the bowl is clean, you set it down so that its front faces the guest once more. Even empty, it deserves the same courtesy as when it was full. Your guest bows slightly toward it, acknowledging not the drink but the vessel that made the drink possible. You return the cloth to its place and draw the kettle's lid slightly open, letting a puff of steam drift into the cooler air. The room receives it without moving, the paper screens holding steady, the alcove still watching. Outside, the faint tap of the bamboo fountain carries in, slower now, as if it too is winding down. A mainstream truth, easy to forget in its simplicity. Every motion in tea pouring, rinsing, wiping is as much for the guest's eyes as for the object itself, not in the sense of performance, but in the sense of reassurance. The guest leaves knowing that nothing was handled carelessly, not even in the final moments. You lift the ladle once more and add a small measure of cool water from the bucket to the kettle. The addition softens the temperature for the tasks to come, keeping the water ready but not restless. A fringe habit, almost superstition, suggests that this gesture also ensures the kettle will wake easily at the next gathering, as though it remembers being treated gently. Your guest watches without comment, but his posture leans forward slightly, a sign of attention that in the tea room is as good as a spoken thanks. You return the ladle to its stand, the handle aligned neatly with the whisk and the scoop. Historians still debate whether this precise arranging of tools developed purely for visual harmony or as a practical way to avoid accidents in tight spaces. Whatever its origin, the effect is the same. Nothing is out of place, and nothing needs to be searched for when it is next needed. Samurai carried this sense of order with them, sometimes more faithfully than they carried their armor. You bow slightly toward the guest, signaling that the final preparations are complete. He answers with the same depth, neither rushed nor reluctant. The tea has been drunk, the bowl has been honored, the tools have been put at ease. The ceremony's spine is intact. The kettle murmurs on, knowing its role is nearly over. Outside, the day has shifted. The light on the garden stones is brighter now, and the shadow of the pine reaches farther across the stepping path. You allow yourself one slow breath before moving on, the kind of breath that closes a chapter without needing to mark the page. You sit back, letting your knees settle into the tatami's familiar weave. The room is quiet in that layered way that makes you aware of every small sound, the kettle's breath, the faint ticking of cooling charcoal, the distant drip where last night's rain still clings to the eaves. The next part is not complicated, yet it has its own posture. You wait. The guest's hands rest lightly on his thighs, his gaze lowered, his breathing steady. He will not reach for the bowl until you make the gesture. This is one of tea's simplest but most telling courtesies, the waiting. A mainstream fact that all schools agree on. In a formal gathering, the host and guest exchange not only tea, but timing. The guest does not touch until invited. The host does not rush the invitation. It is a mutual discipline, each holding still for the other's sake. You let the moment lengthen, just enough to feel its weight, but not enough to make it strain. The stillness between you is like the pause before rain, the kind that makes a leaf lean forward as if to catch the first drop. When you are ready, you place both hands on the mat and incline your head toward the guest. It is a bow of offering without words. He returns the bow, slightly deeper, then reaches for the bowl. His hands move as though the air between you is thicker than usual, slowing the transfer without resistance. A fringe tidbit floats into memory. Some older hosts say this pause is the most refined moment in the whole ceremony, because nothing visible happens and yet the entire shape of the meeting depends on it. The guest takes the bowl in both hands, his left palm supporting the base, his right fingers steadying the side. He bows toward it before lifting it closer, a silent thank you to both host and object. His shoulders remain level, his elbows close to his body. You note this not to judge, but to appreciate. The tea room notices such things even if no one speaks of them. Historians still argue whether the length of this waiting period before the guest drinks was ever formally timed in earlier centuries. Some suggest it was as short as a single breath in less formal settings, while others claim it could stretch to nearly a minute when rank or solemn occasion called for it. The records disagree, and perhaps that is the point. Waiting is shaped by the day, not by a clock. The guest turns the bowl a quarter turn before bringing it to his lips, presenting the front away from himself in respect. You see the small cloud of steam rise between his face and the clay, softening both. His first sip is slow, not because the tea demands it, but because the room does. He swallows, lowers the bowl slightly, and pauses not to speak, not to think, but to let the taste settle into the moment. You keep your eyes lowered during this, the way one looks away when someone else is tying a sash. Privacy in tea is not about absence. It is about allowing the other person to feel unseen without being alone. A mainstream truth, easy to forget. The tea at this stage is no longer just leaf and water. It is the whole series of choices that led here: the arrangement of charcoal, the folding of cloth, the selection of bowl, the pace of conversation. The guest drinks all of it in the same motion. He takes a second sip, the rim touching the same place on his lips as before. Some hosts notice this and quietly approve. Others do not care. You notice because it tells you he is paying attention to the bowl as well as the tea. He drinks the last portion in a single swallow, then lowers the bowl and examines it briefly, turning it in his hands to see the glaze catch the light. A fringe tidbit. Some guests will subtly trace the foot ring with a finger, not out of habit but to feel the bare clay. It is said this gesture came from potters themselves, checking their own work for smoothness. Your guest does this now, lightly, as if asking the bowl to remember him. He turns the bowl back to its original position before placing it on the mat. The movement is slow enough that the sound of clay meeting reed is almost lost beneath the kettle's murmur. He bows toward the bowl, then toward you. The bow is shorter now, thanks for the act just completed, not for the invitation to begin. You return the bow with the same measure, your hands resting once more on your thighs. The tea is gone, the exchange complete, but the etiquette of waiting will remain in the air for several breaths before the next task. In this way, the stillness between host and guest becomes not a gap but a link, a shape that holds the rest of the meeting together. Outside, the bamboo fountain tips and empties, then stands upright again, ready for the next fall. Inside, nothing moves except the steam from the kettle, which curls in the same direction as before, unbothered by the fact that the tea has been drunk. The ceremony's pace has not changed. It only waits, as you do, for the next gesture to rise. You lift the bowl gently from the mat, both hands steady, the way one might lift a sleeping bird that should not be startled. It still holds the faint warmth from the guest's touch, a reminder that the tea has passed from leaf to water to hands and now back to rest. The glaze along the rim shows a thin ring where the foam had been, already drying into a pale trace. Turning the bowl slightly in your hands, you study the front for a moment before rotating it a quarter turn. This is not for display, it is part of the etiquette of return. A mainstream fact every host learns early. When the bowl is placed back on the mat after drinking, it is returned with the front facing the host as a gesture of respect. The host, in turn, rotates it before setting it aside, acknowledging that the exchange has come full circle. You rest the bowl on your left palm while your right hand reaches for the white cloth. Its cotton is soft, worn into obedience by many rinsings. You fold it once, then use the corner to wipe the rim in a single smooth motion, as though sealing away the moment just passed. The clay cools quickly under your touch. The warmth it held is now memory. A fringe tidbit comes to mind, a small superstition from an old teacher. The wiping motion should be even and unbroken, so that the gathering's calm will remain unbroken too. Whether anyone believes this or not is irrelevant. The motion is the same, and the habit is worth keeping. You glance into the bowl's interior. The faint dusting of green at the bottom swirls as you tilt it toward the wastewater vessel. You pour in a measure of warm water from the kettle, enough to loosen what remains, and swirl it 3 times. The sound is hollow, like wind caught in a small jar. You empty it into the vessel without a drop escaping to the mat. Historians still argue whether this specific sequence, wipe, rinse, wipe again, was fixed in place by early masters or evolved gradually as gatherings became more codified. The oldest records give conflicting descriptions, and perhaps that is as it should be. The bowl does not seem to mind which version is the truth. You set the bowl down once more, this time to wipe the interior fully. The cloth moves in wide arcs, folding over itself after each pass to hide the dampness. The glaze is smooth but not glossy. The touch of the cloth makes a sound softer than breath. Once done, you turn the bowl so the front faces the guest again, even though the exchange is over. Courtesy does not check the clock. Your guest bows toward the bowl just enough to acknowledge it without reopening the ceremony. You return the bow, your hand still resting lightly on the clay. The kettle murmurs in the hearth, the same tone it has kept all morning. A mainstream truth, almost too plain to be noticed. The handling of an empty bowl is as revealing as the handling of a full one. In the tea room, the absence of tea does not mean the absence of care. Samurai learned this here, carrying the lesson into how they treated both allies and tools when they were no longer in active use. You lift the bowl to eye level for a final glance at its glaze. The light through the shoji catches a faint speckling of ash near the base, tiny marks left by the kiln's breath centuries ago. You set it beside the other utensils, aligning it so its foot ring rests parallel to the whisk's base. A fringe habit, seen only among the most meticulous hosts, is to angle the bowl ever so slightly toward the guest when placing it down for the last time, a silent thanks for using it well. You do this now, not expecting it to be noticed, but trusting the gesture to carry its weight anyway. The air between you and the guest feels lighter, as if the exchange of tea has taken something unnecessary out of the room. Outside, a pine shadow slides slowly across the stepping stones, the sun having moved while no one was watching. Inside, the tools rest in the order they began, ready to leave the mat in the same piece they arrived. You let your hands rest on your thighs for a breath before lifting the bowl again, this time to return it fully to its place. The clay feels cooler now, the last warmth gone to the air. You tilt it slightly, turning the front toward yourself so you can check for any flecks or drops left behind. The surface is clean. The wiping and rinsing have left it as it was before the gathering began, except perhaps a little more at ease. You set the bowl aside, nearer the hearth but not so close that the heat will trouble it. The space on the mat where it sat feels momentarily bare, as if a chair had been pushed back from a table. The absence will be filled soon enough by the kettle's steam and the presence of the other utensils. Your eyes drift over the whisk, the scoop, the ladle, the caddy, each in its place, each waiting for its turn to leave the mat. A mainstream fact. In a proper gathering, utensils are returned to their starting positions in the reverse order of their use, so the closing mirrors the opening. This quiet symmetry reassures the guest that nothing has been rushed or forgotten. You reach for the tea caddy first, its lacquer dark and deep, the lid catching the faintest line of light from the paper screens. Before you move it, you bow your head slightly toward it, not as ritual exactly, but as a habit of recognition. The caddy receives the bow without ceremony. It is just a box. After all, but in the tea room, even boxes can teach the hand to move with respect. A fringed tidbit drifts in from a record kept by an unusually talkative host. Some once placed the caddy back into its silk pouch in front of the guest, tying the cord with slow, precise knots before setting it aside. Others preferred to do this afterward, in the preparation room, to keep the final moments uncluttered. Today, you leave it unpouched, letting it rest in view until the end. You align the scoop beside it, the curve of its tip facing the whisk. The two seem to lean toward each other, like old companions who prefer not to be separated until the last moment. The whisk itself stands upright on its base, tines spread slightly from use but still even. You turn it so the guest can see the front row of tines, the most regular, the most pleasing, though you do not call attention to it. Historians still argue whether such alignments are purely aesthetic, or whether they once held specific symbolic meanings that have since faded. The old manuals, if they knew, are in no hurry to say. You take up the ladle next, wiping the handle lightly with the corner of the white cloth to remove any trace of moisture. The bowl of the ladle faces down when you set it back on its stand, a habit as practical as it is polite. The stand itself is moved closer to the kettle, returning to the position it occupied before the first scoop of water was drawn. The kettle's breath has thinned. It knows its work is nearly over. You lift the lid slightly to let in a wisp of cooler air, then set it back down so it rests without a click. Even in closing, the kettle is treated like a guest who will return. A mainstream truth, plain enough to be overlooked. The end of a tea gathering is not a dismissal. Every motion tells the guest they are leaving something intact behind a room, a set of tools, a small arrangement of time that will be ready again. You return your hands to your thighs, bow slightly toward the guest, and receive the same bow in return. No words pass. The tools, now at rest, seem to watch the exchange with the patience of objects that know they will be handled again. A fringe story tugs at you of a host who once, after a long and formal gathering, spent more time putting away the utensils than he had in preparing them. When asked why, he said, "They did their duty in front of a guest. They should be returned to rest as carefully as they were brought to work." Whether or not the story is true, the habit has its own logic. The mat before you is almost clear now, the objects either removed or gathered near the hearth. Outside, the garden is brighter, the stones warm under the sun. Inside, the ceremony is folding itself into its own ending, not with a snap, but with the slow turn of a page. You let your hands rest and lift your eyes to the alcove again, as though the room itself has asked you to read what it has been saying all morning. The hanging scroll is the tallest voice here, though it speaks in a whisper. Ink thins and gathers along each stroke. Where the brush paused, a small lake forms, dark and sure. Where it moved quickly, the fibers of the paper drink less, leaving a faint gray that looks like breath on winter glass. You do not lean forward. Distance is part of the etiquette of looking, the same way silence is part of the etiquette of listening. A plain mainstream fact keeps its footing. The scroll chosen for season and occasion sets the meeting's tone. A single character can imply early spring or late autumn. A brief Zen phrase can invite humility. A poem can offer weather when the sky refuses to cooperate. Samurai learned to let such choices tutor their manners. If the scroll reads calm, you lower your voice. If it reads winter, you sit nearer the fire. If it hints at transience, you stop trying to make anything last longer than it should. The scroll is a gate. Passing through it changes the way one walks. You study the mounting, the pale silk borders framing the paper, the darker silk at top and bottom carrying a muted pattern that only appears when the light decides to say yes. A small crease near the lower edge tells a story of unrolling in a room less patient than this one. The roller rod is lacquered wood, its ends capped by round knobs that have been turned smooth by generations of careful fingers. The cord that binds the scroll in its box when the meeting is over hangs to one side, tidy and unknotted, like a sentence not yet finished. The brushwork has a particular gait. The first stroke lands with confidence, broad at the heel, slimming as it runs. The second turns inward, a pivot that stores energy rather than spending it. The last rises and leaves the paper as if the brush remembered it was also a bird. You trace this path with your eyes and feel your breath copy it. A long exhale tapering to quiet. Your guest watches the same way, and between you a small agreement forms. Neither of you needs to say a word for the scroll to have done its work. A fringed tidbit bows at the doorway of memory. Some hosts keep a tiny envelope of incense chips in the scroll's storage box, not to perfume the future viewing, but to dry the air and keep mold from taking liberties. On rare mornings when the room is especially damp, the faintest trace of fragrance rides the paper like a ghost of yesterday's temple. It is not meant to be noticed. It is meant to keep forgetting possible. You let your gaze fall to the seal marks in red small squares that look like polite interruptions. The marks can declare the calligrapher's name, a studio, a mood, or nothing anyone now living can read with certainty. Historians still argue whether several celebrated seals on tea room scrolls belong to the hands they claim or were added later by collectors who wanted to escort prestige into their alcoves. Ink ages honestly. Seals, it turns out, sometimes arrive late to the party. The debate continues, and the scroll remains a better host than any of the arguers. You tilt your head slightly, and the paper shows its fibers mulberry threads like pale veins, uneven in a way that refuses to be made by machine. A faint watermark blossoms near the lower corner, either a mounter's quiet flourish or an accident that mounted itself into charm. You note a minuscule repair, a sliver of paper backing where a careless hand once let a fingernail taste the edge. The mend is clean, almost proud, and you feel a kinship with everything in this room that has been made whole more than once. Your guest's eyes circle the characters without landing on them like a hawk. He is not reading aloud, and neither are you. In tea, reading a scroll is closer to weather than to grammar. You take it in through the skin as much as through the mind. He murmurs that the strokes feel morning, and you answer that the paper feels patient. These are not judgments. They are the smallest of bridges across the space between two people kneeling on the same mat. A mainstream truth puts its sandals by the door. Many hosts choose phrases that temper the spirit: quiet, suchness, one, taste, or a season, word clipped from poetry. When warriors learned to pass beneath such words before negotiating, the edges of their speech rounded off a little, and the day cost fewer regrets. The record shows no miracle, but it does show men who sat straighter and spoke shorter after bowing to ink. You look at the top roller, where the hanging cord loops. The knot is practiced, neither complicated nor careless. You remember how, before dawn, you unboxed the scroll from its paulownia case, the light wood cool in your hands, the inner lid brushed with swift characters. A title, perhaps, a name, or a confident lie that has been repeated so well it behaves like truth. You unrolled the paper on a low table and watched the characters breathe as the curve flattened. The moment of choice this scroll today felt less like deciding and more like recognizing a face in a crowd. A quirky, half-hidden habit visits and leaves without staying. In some households, when a favored scroll must rest after a long, damp season, it is hung for a day in an empty room facing a wall, so the paper can remember its strength without the vanity of being looked at. Whether this helps the fibers or simply scolds the ego is impossible to say. The practice persists because it harms nothing and pleases caretakers who like their rituals tidy. You trace the negative space with your eyes, the white that allows the black to be legible, the pauses that make the strokes into language. In this, you find a lesson broader than the alcove. Samurai etiquette learned to use absence the way calligraphy uses paper. A meeting not held, a word not said, a gesture declined. These are strokes the world can read if the margins are wide enough. Historians still argue whether the particular phrases most beloved in tea were already famous in the monasteries before masters of the 16th century borrowed them, or whether tea made them famous by repetition until monks politely agreed they must have always mattered. The diaries offer hints and then change the subject. The scroll does not care about provenance nearly as much as conduct. Your guest bows toward the alcove, small, respectful. As one bows before entering a room where someone is sleeping, you match the bow and feel the scroll bow back, if only in the way the silk settles when the air shifts. No blessing is spoken. None is required. The kettle's voice returns to the center of your attention, low and regular, as if reminding you that paper can correct posture, but water teaches time. Before you lower your gaze, you take one last inventory of small details. The mount's top border, slightly darker than the bottom. A thread pulled a hair's width near the corner, a dot where the brush sprang too soon and left a freckle. These are the bowl's chip and the kettle's scratch translated into ink. Tea prefers its perfections to breathe through flaws. You return your eyes to the mat and your hands to your thighs. The alcove resumes its watch without you, as it has for mornings you were not here, and will for mornings when someone else kneels in your place. The scroll's work is finished and not finished. Its words keep setting the tone even when no one is looking. In the quiet that follows, you understand again why such a slender thing can shape men who wear heavy habits. The room exhales. The camellia keeps its own counsel. The kettle remembers pine wind. And you, having watched ink dry centuries ago, prepare to stand and lift water that is ready now. The scroll will remain unspeaking, having taught you a sentence you will not repeat, only live. You place a small lacquer tray between you and the guest, the surface dark as a pond at dusk. On it rests a sweet that looks as if the season had been persuaded to sit still for a moment. Before tea's quiet edge comes to the tongue again, sweetness is invited to prepare the way. The room does not hurry this part. Sugar asks for calm hands. You unfold your pocket paper, white sheets folded and kept at the breast. A small convenience with a proud name. The paper opens with a whisper, tidy as a bell you can only hear with your fingertips. A slim wooden pick lies beside the sweet, cut from fragrant wood, so the hand remembers the tree while the mouth considers the sugar. You lift the pick and breathe in the gentle scent, more suggestion than presence, as if a grove were bowing from far away. The sweet itself is modest, perhaps a soft bean paste center clothed in a skin the color of early plum, or a dry pressed candy shaped like a maple seed with ridges, so fine a fly could rest in them. You study its edges, not to praise them, but to see where the first bite will leave the cleanest line. A mainstream fact kneels here and waits to be noticed. In gatherings like this, the sweet is taken before the tea, to calm bitterness and prepare the mouth. The practice is so settled that even men who argue over schools do not argue over this order. You set the sweet upon the paper, not the mat, and test the pick against its skin. The wood yields nothing. The sweet yields everything. A clean cut answers a clean intention. You bring the first portion to your lips and let it rest there a moment, greeting it with breath before teeth. The flavor rises slowly: bean, sugar, a hint of something that could be salt or could be your memory of winter. You swallow without noise. The kettle murmurs approval from the hearth. Your guest mirrors your movements with unself-conscious care. His pick moves as if he were trimming a stray thread from a sleeve. The paper beneath catches the smallest crumbs, so the mat will not. He eats without touching the sweet to his fingers, not from squeamishness, but from a desire to keep the room free of sugar's invisible stickiness. In such small, repeatable motions, etiquette teaches the body to love tidiness for its own sake. You notice how the confection carries the day's weather inside it. If it is spring, the color leans toward new leaf or the pale blush of a bud that has not yet decided. If it is autumn, a dusting suggests the cool bloom on a persimmon. In winter, the surface is sometimes drier, like frost. The shapes do not shout their season, they hint. A petal may be suggested by a fold, a river by a scored line, snow by a faint veil of sugar that refuses to sparkle. Historians still argue whether the regular use of such season-marked sweets in tea took firm root under the severe taste of the 16th century master, whose shadow lengthens across every hearth, or whether later hands made the practice stricter and more poetic than he intended. Diaries praise restraint, inventories list molds, but the boundary between preference and rule is a fence no one can find in the grass. You take a second bite, the sweetness moves from front of tongue brightness to a rounder warmth that will meet the tea without quarreling. A fringe tidbit walks in without knocking. Some hosts prefer picks cut from the aromatic wood used for toothpicks in polite company, a custom that leaves the breath with a faint woodland courtesy. Others keep a tiny sprig of the same shrub at the preparation shelf and rub the pick once along it before placing it down, an invisible favor that no guest is required to notice. You keep your pick angled so it never points at the guest like a tiny spear. When you rest it, the tip faces your own wrist, a small geometry of harmlessness. The paper bears the sweet's faint imprint where it sat, a small oval of translucent shine. You fold the used portion of the paper inward, not to hide anything shameful, but to keep the crumbs together. Then lay the remaining clean square on top like a roof. In the tea room, even trash behaves. Your guest finishes his portion and places the pick on the edge of his paper so the tip does not touch the mat. He bows a breath toward the tray. You return the bow, then draw the tray back with both hands. The sweet has finished speaking. The bowl will speak next, and with better grammar. A mainstream truth leans its elbows on the low table of memory. Sugar, once a rare visitor, became easier to welcome as trade widened and pockets deepened. Yet in the tea room, it never learned to boast. Even when abundance allowed variety, hosts favored modest sizes and flavors that did not perfume the air like a marketplace. The sweet must walk in beside the season, not ahead of it. You think of old notes that mention a warrior praised for the way he held his pick steady, never stabbing, and for how he waited after swallowing before he reached for the bowl. Small praise, small skill, but the accumulation of such smallness made rooms like this survivable when tempers elsewhere were busy sharpening. Another fringe tidbit curls at the edge of propriety. A few guests, traveling far and hungry longer than honor, prefers to admit, would quietly tuck the last morsel of a dry sweet into the fold of their paper and place it in a sleeve, to be eaten on the road where a river's voice could hide the sound. No manual endorses this. No manual condemns it. Tea knows that hunger is also a season. You slide the tray aside and place the folded paper near your knee. The fragrance of the pick lingers after its work is done. You set it on the tray with the point turned inward and the handle toward the guest, a habit that allows borrowing if needed and exacts no explanation. The kettle lifts its voice a shade. The water is eager to be useful again. Historians still argue whether the particular sequence of motions paper opened, sweet moved, first cut left, second cut right, pick rested across the top edge, was truly uniform across regions, or whether much of the uniformity is the tidy wish of later instructors who dislike the past's cheerful variations. The surviving drawings are careful. The surviving hands were probably less so. Your own hands choose the version that belongs to this room and this morning, which is the only version that matters now. You look at the guest's posture. His shoulders have lost the last small tension that even good manners conceal. Sweetness, used correctly, does not excite. It reassures. The bitterness of tea will come as a teacher, not a scold. The two flavors shake hands in advance and agree not to waste anyone's time. You set the tray aside fully, returning the room to its earlier geometry kettle. Bowl, whisk, caddy, flower, scroll each a letter in the sentence you have been writing so slowly that no one noticed it became a sentence. Your palms rest once more upon your thighs. Your gaze lowers. The next motion waits at the edge of your breath. Outside, the bamboo fountain tips and remembers its duty. Inside, the camellia keeps thinking about whether to open. The air is near enough to noon that light has started to stand straighter on the floor. You let one more grain of thyme dissolve on your tongue and prepare to lift the ladle. The mouth is ready, the hands are ready, the room has always been ready. You rest your palms lightly on your knees, letting the warmth of the sweet fade until only a ghost of flavor lingers. The kettle hums in its low voice, the lid giving a faint, occasional rattle, as if reminding you it is still attentive. You shift your weight slightly forward, reaching for the ladle with the same measured motion you used hours or perhaps only minutes ago. In the tea room, time folds so neatly it forgets which side is up. The handle of the ladle rests cool in your fingers, the bamboo polished smooth by years of water and cloth. You lift it from its stand without letting the bowl swing. The curve of the handle is subtle, not a perfect arc, which is exactly what makes it pleasant to hold. A mainstream fact waits at your elbow. The ladle's length and bowl size were settled generations ago, designed to scoop just the right measure of water for one portion without waste or hurry. Even samurai who could order custom weapons found no reason to alter this balance. You tilt the ladle toward the kettle, the bowl dipping in to catch a portion of steaming water. The sound is a soft hiss, like rain greeting the lip of a jar. You draw it up, droplets sliding along the bamboo stem to meet the joint where handle and bowl are bound with thin strips of rattan. The water trembles but does not spill. You turn the ladle in a slow half circle, letting the surface tension hold the measure in place, and pour it into the wastewater vessel to warm it. The vessel sighs in response, steam curling up into the still air. A fringed tidbit stirs in memory. Some hosts, when the room is especially cold, will warm the wastewater vessel before the gathering by placing a single ember near its base for a short time. This is not in the manuals, but neither is the advice to wear socks in winter. The omission does not mean the habit is foolish. You dip the ladle again, this time into the clean water jar at your side. The jar's lid is lacquered, and as you lift it, a cool breath escapes water's own reminder that it is patient until called. The ladle moves without haste, carrying its burden to the kettle's mouth. You let the water slide in, the pitch of the kettle's hum shifting slightly, as if welcoming a guest who has just arrived at the right moment. Historians still argue whether the exact number of ladlefuls used to adjust the kettle's temperature was a fixed standard in the earliest schools, or whether it was guided more by instinct and the day's weather. The written guides differ, and the truth, as often in tea, seems to live between pages rather than on them. You return the ladle to its stand for a moment, the handle angled precisely so it will not roll. The stand itself is placed so that neither host nor guest will brush against it while reaching for other utensils, a geometry learned through years of minor accidents that no one cares to repeat. Steam rises in a more deliberate column now. You watch it for a few breaths, noting how it bends slightly toward the window. Outside, something perhaps a cedar casts a shadow that shivers with each breeze, and the steam accepts these shivers as its own. A mainstream truth leans forward. The handling of the ladle is one of the most revealing moments for any guest to watch. Grip it too tightly and you seem eager, too loosely and you seem careless. The balance is the same. A warrior seeks with a sword firm enough to control, light enough to release without struggle. The tea room gives this lesson without anyone bleeding over it. You lift the ladle again, pouring warm water into the tea bowl to ready it. The sound is deep and soft, the water striking clay that has been smoothed by countless rinsings. You swirl it gently, holding the bowl in one hand while the other steadies the ladle. The warmth seeps into your fingers, and the glaze darkens as it drinks. You pour the water into the wastewater vessel, then wipe the bowl's rim with the white cloth in a slow, even motion. A fringe story, too trivial for the official record, wanders across your mind. An old host once claimed that if the ladle is lifted too quickly, the water feels startled and will not taste the same. No one could prove it, but everyone who heard it began lifting their ladles a shade slower, just in case. You return the ladle to its stand again, handle angled exactly as before. The kettle's voice steadies, holding the note it will keep until the tea is made. The bowl before you is warm, the air between you and the guest clear of any need for words. Outside, a bird sings once and stops, as if unwilling to disturb the symmetry. The tools are in place, the water is ready, and your hands remember what they have done hundreds of times before. You glance at the guest, who inclines his head just enough to say he is prepared without speaking. The next motion will draw the tea from caddy to bowl, from powder to foam, from courtesy to shared silence. You turn your attention to the tea caddy, its lacquered surface still catching light as though it has been listening to the whole morning. The lid sits flush, the join so fine it could be the seam of a seed. You cradle the caddy in your left hand, the way you would carry something alive that might startle if gripped too hard. A mainstream fact waits patiently here. The caddy is more than a container. It is a stage for the powdered tea, protecting it from moisture and stray scents. In formal gatherings, its form and finish are chosen with the same care as a warrior chooses armor. Not for ornament alone, but because the first impression matters even to leaves that have long since been ground into dust. You lift the lid with your right hand, turning it slightly so that the guest can glimpse the green powder inside without leaning forward. The tea rests in a small mound, the surface level except for a faint hollow where the bamboo scoop will soon pass. The color is a green that has outlived summer, neither bright nor dull, but steady. You set the lid carefully on the mat beside you, open side up like a bowl in miniature. The scoop lies across the caddy's mouth for a breath before you take it. Its curve fits the hollow in your fingers, as though it has been teaching you to hold it since you were a child. You dip it gently into the powder, drawing up a small measure and tapping the handle lightly against the rim, two soft notes in the room's ongoing music. A fringe tidbit comes to mind. In certain old households, the first scoop of tea for a guest was drawn slightly larger than the rest, not for generosity alone, but to honor the start of the drinking. The idea was that the guest's first mouthful should feel like a gift, and all later ones like a conversation. You let the powder fall into the warm bowl, where it lands like mist settling on a pond. The green spreads slightly against the pale glaze, an island forming in a calm sea. You take another scoop, smaller this time, and add it beside the first. The air above the bowl is already faintly fragrant vegetal, a little sweet, carrying a trace of something dry and clean like fresh split wood. Historians still argue whether the exact number of scoops for thick or thin tea was fixed by the earliest masters or codified only later when schools competed for precision. Manuals hint at both traditions, but each seems to have borrowed from the other without confessing it. You replace the scoop across the caddy's mouth and return the lid to its place with a turn that leaves the grain of the lacquer aligned with the front of the bowl. Such alignments are rarely noticed, but are never accidental. You set the caddy down just far enough that the guest can see it clearly without feeling crowded by it. Your hands return to the bowl. The powder rests at the bottom, waiting for water. You tilt the bowl slightly so the green slides toward one side, an unspoken cue that the whisk will enter at that angle. The kettle's steam curls closer, as if drawn by the scent. A mainstream truth sits between you and the guest. The movement from caddy to bowl is a quiet invitation. The guest does not reach for the tea or comment on its shade. Watching is part of receiving. Touching comes only when offered. The scoop, now resting, bears a fine dust of green along its inner curve. You resist the urge to tap it clean. That will come later, in its proper place. The discipline of tea often lives in the seconds when the hand could act but waits instead. A fringe story from the edges of the record drifts into the quiet. One samurai, impatient with ceremony, once asked his host why the tea could not be measured ahead of time. The host replied, "Then you would drink your tea as you fight your battles, knowing the end before you begin." No answer was recorded, but the impatient guest attended 3 more gatherings that month. You shift your focus back to the bowl. 2 measures of tea rest within. The first slightly larger, the second more modest, the pair together forming a proportion learned from repetition rather than arithmetic. The green waits for the water, and you wait for the kettle's breath to reach the exact shade of steam that says it is ready. The ladle will rise again soon, but for now you let the moment hold. Powder, bowl, steam, 3 points of a triangle that will soon collapse into one drink. Your guest lowers his gaze, as though bowing to the tea itself, and you match the gesture without thinking. The room has gathered everything it needs. Nothing remains but the joining. You look up and let your eyes soften until the white of the shoji stops being white and becomes weather. The paper stretches between slender ribs of wood a small landscape that holds whatever the day decides to paint on it. Right now, the pines outside are drawing with their needles thin strokes that sway and pause and sway again. The shadows move like calligraphy that has forgotten its words and kept only its rhythm. You do not try to read it. You let it pass through you, the way steam passes through air and leaves it warmer for having visited. The kettle's breath steadies your own. You adjust the bowl a finger's width, not because the light demands it, but because the light rewards it. When the pale beam angles just so, the green powder at the bottom looks deeper. When the beam drifts, the green lightens as if the forest has stepped a pace back. This is the room's sly lesson about etiquette. Do not fight the day. Place yourself where the day already means to be. A mainstream fact lives contentedly here. Tea rooms were made with deliberate smallness, not only to level rank as guests bow through a low door, but to welcome light as an equal participant. The paper screens, tatami weave, and unpainted wood are chosen not for richness, but for how they receive morning, noon, and late light without argument. Samurai who trained here learned to measure themselves by light's patience rather than by noise or polish. You watch the shoji as a cloud passes, and the room's temperature seems to lower by a thought. The ink of the hanging scroll darkens. The camellia's bud becomes more private. You tilt your head and let the change register in the hands rather than in the mind. If you were to whisk now, the wrist would move at a slower pace. If you were to speak now, the sentence would end sooner. Light tells tempo. Etiquette obeys. The shadow of a bamboo leaf touches the kettle's lid like a brush swirl and then lifts away. You are tempted to follow it with your gaze all the way until it leaves the paper, but tea discourages chasing. You prefer to receive. The guest notices the same flicker and does not point it out. Good manners include letting beauty come and go without dragging it into conversation where it will die of too much air. A quirky fringe tidbit glides in from an old gardener's notebook. Some hosts used to plant a particular grass near the window so that its seed heads would cast the finest possible lines on the shoji during autumn afternoons, a secret way of weaving season into the wall. The grass had no official name in tea manuals. It had many in gardens. Whether guests recognized the signature was irrelevant, the room did. You let your eyes trace the wood lattice beneath the paper. The grid is not exactly square. No corner is clean. The slight irregularity welcomes the day more warmly than perfection would. You feel this in your shoulders. Straightness without stiffness, that is the posture tea wants from you. The guest's spine seems to understand the same instruction. His elbows rest nearer his ribs now, his fan aligned with his knees, as if the lattice has taught him how to belong to lines. Wind considers the garden and decides against it. The shadows steady. You hear the bamboo fountain outside tip and return, its hollow knock locating noon with more certainty than the sun does. The sound lands on the paper wall like a soft signature. For a breath, the room feels lacquered, everything sealed in clarity. You do nothing with this feeling. You let it pass, unhandled, so it can remain itself. Historians still argue whether the famous preference for dimness in tea, what later writers praised as the beauty of half-light, was consciously cultivated by early masters, or mostly the unavoidable result of small rooms lit by oil and sky. The treatises praise shadow as if it were doctrine. The carpenter's bills suggest thrift. You take no position. The shoji makes one unnecessary. The dimness is here, and it is enough. Your gaze returns to the bowl. The powder at the bottom is a dark island again. The light has slanted. You realize that without noticing you've been breathing in time with the moving shadows. A slow inhale when a cloud thins the brightness. A slow exhale when a pine needle scribble thickens it. The body learns from paper. A warrior who studies light this carefully will not mistake a twitch for an insult or a pause for weakness. He will wait for changes that reveal themselves rather than invent ones that do not. You pass the white cloth once across your left palm, as if erasing chalk from a slate. No dust transfers habit. Not need. The cloth returns to its place with a whisper. The kettle lets go of a string of tiny sounds. Bubbles lifted and swallowed, each one too small to own a name. Another stray tidbit, half smile and half superstition. A few old hosts believed that if a bird's shadow crossed the shoji at the precise moment water met powder, The froth would hold finer, and the drinker would become gentler by a hair's width for the length of one conversation. No school teaches this. No school forbids it. The story persists because it harms nothing and pleases those who quietly ask the day to help when no one is watching. You notice the window's lower lattice catching a gleam from the wastewater bowl. The reflected light lays a bright rectangle over the mat. You move the bowl a finger to the left, and the rectangle softens. The guest pretends not to see your adjustment while noticing it completely. This is the treaty you both signed by stepping inside. Each will make the room calm for the other, and neither will brag. The shoji brightens. A patch of sun, filtered through leaves, speckles the paper with coins of light that come and go. You count 3 before the pattern changes, not with numbers but with breath. When they fade, you feel the small loss, the way you might feel a word failing to arrive. Then you feel the relief of the plain white returning. Tea trains the heart to accept arrival and departure at the speed of a shadow. The scroll accepts the brighter hour without altering its message. The flower does the same. You let your wrists loosen, fingers resting like quiet birds on your knees. The etiquette shaped by light has done its work. Your pace has slowed without you commanding it. Outside the shoji, a dragonfly carves a line in sun and is gone. Its shadow never enters. Inside, your eyes lower, not from modesty, but to seal the lesson where hands can find it later. Historians still argue whether certain schools preferred north-facing windows to keep light steady, or south-facing to welcome the drama of the day. Surviving floor plans display both choices with equal confidence. You can almost hear the old builders shrugging. The right window is simply the one that teaches the host to see. You blink, and the paper returns to being paper. The shoji is no longer weather. It is the respectful border between kettle and hedge. You bow your head a breath, as if thanking a teacher who has left the room. The light, satisfied, moves on to the garden stones, where it will practice brightness on harder pupils. You bring your attention back to the bowl and the caddy and the waiting ladle. The shadow play has tuned your motions to a key you did not name. You will whisk at that pitch and pour at that speed. The guest inhales and his sleeve rustles. The sound is a leaf across silk. The room holds steady. The next act will begin with water, because the light has already taught everything else. You lift your hands from your knees and hover them above the mat, the smallest pause before you move. A hinge filmed with oil. The shoji glows no longer a stage, only a witness. You reach for the ladle, and your wrists carry the hush of afternoon shadows into the arc of bamboo. The day has written itself on paper. You will write it into tea. You take the ladle in your right hand, the curve of its bamboo handle pressing lightly into the base of your fingers. The kettle's steam greets you, warmer now, as if it has been waiting for the cue. The water's voice is steady but with a faint urgency, like a singer holding the last note before the chorus begins. A mainstream fact settles into the scene. In the etiquette of chanoyu, the water's temperature is not an afterthought. It shapes the froth, the flavor, and the very pace of the whisking. Too hot, and the tea can burn, turning sharp. Too cool, and it will sulk, refusing to bloom. The host learns to read steam as others read faces. You dip the ladle into the kettle's mouth, the bamboo bowl meeting the water with a quiet kiss. The ladle fills, a clear measure, and you lift it slowly, letting a few drops escape back into the kettle's lip. These are not mistakes, they are rehearsed gestures, reminders to the water that it is about to be transformed. The arc from kettle to bowl is small but exact. You pour the water over the green mound, not directly in the center, but slightly to one side, letting it spread and carry the powder outward. The sound is soft and full, the way rainwater sounds when it falls on moss instead of stone. The air between you and the guest thickens with a faint grassy sweetness. A fringe tidbit drifts in. Some early tea practitioners claimed that pouring water directly onto the center of the powder startled it, producing a more bitter taste. Whether this was chemistry or superstition, it became habit in many lineages to approach the tea at an angle, as if greeting it from the side rather than confronting it head-on. You return the ladle to its stand and take up the whisk. The tines are fine, their tips a little darker from use, each split reed cut by hand. You set it into the water just above the powder and begin the slow, deliberate first strokes, drawing the liquid over the tea. coaxing it into suspension rather than rushing to froth. The bowl's warmth seeps into your palm, and the faint vibration of whisk against glaze hums up your wrist. Historians still argue whether the modern emphasis on a high foam in thin tea gatherings was as important to earlier masters. Some records describe the ideal surface as soft like mist, others as thick like cloud, and no one agrees which image came first. The whisking speeds up, your wrist light but steady. The green deepens, then pales slightly as air folds into it. You move in small, fast motions, back and forth rather than in circles, creating a fine lattice of bubbles that soon knits into a foam. The guest watches without leaning forward, his gaze steady but without claim. A mainstream truth is that the whisk's motion is not only about mixing but about listening. The sound changes as the foam builds a faint hiss at first, then a softer brushing as the tines meet resistance from the air now woven into the liquid. This change tells you when to slow, when to lift. A fringe observation, passed on like gossip. Some tea men could tell the quality of a whisk simply by the sound it made during the first 10 strokes, claiming they could predict how long it would last before the tines lost their spring. You finish with a slow, lifting motion, bringing the whisk center up through the middle of the foam to create a small rise, a mountain that will settle just enough before the bowl is offered. The surface is smooth, the bubbles fine and even, their edges catching the dim light like tiny mirrors. The whisk rests now on its stand, the handle angled away from the guest, a small courtesy that also protects the tines. The bowl sits in front of you, the tea breathing faint tendrils of steam. The green is no longer the flat shade of powder but a living surface, shifting slightly as the foam adjusts to the room's air. Historians still argue whether certain schools preferred presenting the bowl immediately after whisking or letting it rest for a short moment so the flavors could marry beneath the foam. Diaries show both, but in the end, the decision is more about the host's reading of the guest than any fixed law. You wipe your fingertips briefly on your knees, not for cleanliness, but to remind them of their next duty. The turn, the offer, the shared stillness before the first sip. The kettle hums on, unoffended by being ignored for a breath. The guest shifts minutely, perhaps sensing the tea is ready, perhaps only stretching a knee. Your eyes meet without directness. In this exchange, the next movement has already been agreed upon in silence. You slide the bowl forward with both hands, the rim angled toward the guest, the front of the bowl presented as if bowing. The foam trembles but does not break. Outside, the wind brushes the eaves. Inside, the bowl waits in its green calm, the steam carrying a warmth that is almost weightless. Your own breath slows to match. Soon, the guest will lift the tea, but for now, the offering is enough. You place your hands on the mat, fingertips aligned and quiet, and let your spine remember the shape it has practiced 1,000 mornings. The room has grown even stiller since the last sip. Steam unthreads itself more slowly, and the paper screens hold the light as if balancing a bowl on their palms. Bowing now is not an exit. It is a way of fitting your body back into the room's original sentence, so that the period lands where it was always meant to. Your guest shifts a breath, and you answer by lowering your gaze. The movement begins where good movements always begin, in the neck that yields before the back, in the shoulders that agree before the hips. You sink forward from the hips with nothing forced. The line from crown to tail, neither stiff nor slack. The hands advance a finger's width and stop, as if finding a familiar threshold. A mainstream fact takes its place beside you. In formal tea, the bow to close a serving is measured deeper than greeting, but not as deep as apology. Long enough to be felt in the ribs, short enough not to wander. Schools differ in phrasing, but the body knows the height of sincerity without a ruler. Your sleeves slide forward, and you keep them from wandering by the slightest pressure of your forearms against your thighs. The mat's weave greets the heel of your hand, the faint rasp reminding you that nothing in this room is glossy enough to become a mirror. You hold the angle, letting breath settle into the bow instead of using the bow to chase breath. When you rise, you do so on the exhale, so that nothing snatches. Your guest mirrors you, his bow a shade deeper, proper, given your roles. The difference is not a performance, it is the grammar of respect. Historians still argue whether the exact depths and durations of bows were fixed under the stern taste of the 16th century master, whose shadow cools most hearths, or whether later instructors chiseled what had been affectionate habit into tidy law. Diaries give hints, manuals give diagrams. Bodies remember a curve and call it tradition. You bow again, a smaller nod this time, to accept his thanks without turning it into a contest of humility. The room prefers bows to end before they begin to look like bargaining. A fringe tidbit sways into place. Some old hosts taught pupils to listen for the kettle when deciding how long to hold a bow. The time between two soft taps from the iron's lid was counted as enough. Whether this was superstition or wisdom hardly matters. It kept bows from outgrowing their usefulness. Your hands withdraw to your thighs and rest there, the fingers together, the thumbs discreet. You keep your eyes lowered the way one screens a lamp with a palm present, not shining into another's gaze. Your guest settles, then gives a final bow toward the alcove, a polite farewell to brush and bloom. You echo it, the two of you including the scroll and flower as witnesses whose presence deserves the same curving of the spine as any lord. A mainstream truth sits comfortably in the silence. Bowing in the tea room is not a separate art from bowing in the outer world. Many warriors learned here to let the neck soften without losing dignity, to let the back speak without bending the will. Outside, such bows could cool a meeting before it boiled. Inside, they keep heat where it belongs, under the kettle, not in the chest. You shift your fan a finger's width to align with your knees, then tip your chin the smallest degree, a signal that the exchange is complete. Your guest answers with a breath you can hear only because you are listening to nothing else. The etiquette of endings is like laying a lid on a pot. Too light and it chatters, too heavy and it silences what should still be audible. Your thoughts pass over the low entrance door, remembering how even the proud bow to pass beneath it. Not everyone loves being reminded to lower himself. The tea room does not debate the matter. It simply offers a doorway that makes argument unnecessary. Historians still argue whether such architectural humbling truly softened rank or simply dressed it in better manners. Letters from the time tell of lords who bowed smoothly and commanded roughly an hour later. Yet the same letters praise meetings saved by a measured bow that let both sides keep face. Which force shaped which hand will remain a question even after the paper fades. You tilt forward once more, just a breath's worth, to acknowledge the guest's patience today. The bow is half a word, the rest of the syllable supplied by the kettle's murmur. A fringe custom, more hinted at than taught. Some hosts place the lightest pressure of the tongue against the roof of the mouth at the lowest point of the bow to keep breath from catching. It leaves no mark, like all good aids to composure. Your guest returns a final bow to the utensils, first to the bowl, then to the whisk, then to the catty eyes pausing on each, as if naming them without sound. You follow, because thanks travels in both directions, and tools perform better when they are treated like elders whose stories you still wish to hear. The body remembers older bows, the quick nod of camp, the deep tilt before a gate, the prostrations of shrine mornings. Tea's bow sits between them, refusing spectacle, refusing stinginess. A mainstream fact repeats itself because it never grows tired. The seiza posture that undergirds these bows asks for discipline, and the discipline returns the favor by making small, precise movements possible without pain. The mat, in return, forgives the knees. You rise a finger's breadth and stop, feeling for that place where rising becomes a continuation of the bow rather than its cancellation. The distinction is thin and crucial. A bow that snaps upward is a door slammed. A bow that lengthens into sitting is a door at rest. The guest sees the difference as clearly as he would see a line of spear points closing or opening a lane. A small, odd story flits across your memory. A teacher once balanced a peel-thin coin on a pupil's neck while he bowed. If the coin slid forward, the neck was too stiff. If it fell backward, the spine had collapsed. The correct bow held the coin without clamping, a lesson the pupil carried into every meeting after, even where coins did not attend. Whether the story is true or sharpened by retelling, the necks it corrected belong to the tale either way. You and your guest share one last lowering of the eyes, less than a bow, more than a blink. It is the acknowledgement that the day will pick you both up by the shoulders the moment you leave. The tea room equips you for that grasp by reminding the muscles what dignity feels like when it is quiet. Outside, the bamboo fountain tilts and empties, then waits a heartbeat longer than usual before returning. Inside, the kettle loosens its song as the embers coax it down. You arrange the silence like charcoal larger pieces at the edges, smaller in the middle, where the heat will gather, so that the next word spoken in the outer world will catch with less smoke. Your hands place the fukusa beside the knee. You bow to it as to a junior who has worked well, then to the mat that endured your weight, then to the guest who shared the air with you without trying to own it. The bows are brief, specific, sufficient. When you lift your head, the room has not changed. The scroll still holds its breath. The camellia still considers opening. The shoji still lends the day a place to lean. But you have changed by the width of a bowl lowered and raised, emptied and refilled. This is how tea shapes etiquette, not by order, but by repetition until the body agrees to be kind without instruction. You keep your eyes low for one more heartbeat, then let them return to level. The bows have finished speaking. They leave behind the exact amount of quiet the room needs to end properly, which is to say, without ending at all, only turning, like a door that never slams, into the next necessary stillness. You lift the tea bowl gently, the glaze cool now beneath your fingertips. The foam inside has collapsed into a thin ring clinging to the inner wall, its pale green softening toward the color of worn jade. The scent lingers, a mix of grass after rain and something faintly toasty from the kettle's breath. You turn the bowl once in your hands, not for show, but to examine the glaze as hosts have done for centuries. A mainstream fact rests comfortably in the motion. Tea bowls are appreciated not only for their function, but as objects of study. Samurai and merchants alike learn to read their shapes, glazes, and firing marks the way one might read a family crest. In some circles, a gathering's conversation after the last sip turned entirely to the bowl, its potter, its kiln, its journey to the host's hands. You set the bowl closer to your side, preparing to cleanse it. The whisk waits, still slightly damp, its bamboo tines clinging together in orderly rows. You lift it with your right hand and set it into the wastewater bowl. The sound is a small sigh, as if the whisk approves of the bath. You roll it gently between your palms, not enough to bend the tines, just enough to loosen the last traces of tea. A fringed tidbit drifts through memory. Some old tea men claim that the whisk's first rinse after use could tell the future of the next gathering. If the water clouded evenly, the next guest would be harmonious. If streaked, expect small frictions. Whether anyone truly believed this is uncertain, but it was a reason to rinse with care. Historians still argue whether the meticulous cleaning of utensils during the gathering originated from deep spiritual discipline or from simple practicality, removing tea before it dried hard. The scrolls praise purity. The inventories show hosts keeping costly bowls in rotation by careful washing. You dry the whisk lightly on a folded cloth, returning it to its stand with the handle angled just so. The ladle follows, lifted from its rest and tilted to drain before being laid across the kettle's lid. Each motion is familiar enough that the muscles could complete them without the mind, but you keep the mind present. A movement without attention is only a half gesture, and in the tea room, half gestures tend to echo. You lift the caddy next, its lid smooth under your fingers. A trace of powder remains at the bottom, dark and fine. You tip it slightly toward the guest, so that, if he wishes, he can see the interior before you close it. The lid turns once before settling, neither too loose nor too tight, a balance learned over years of small corrections. A mainstream truth flows in. Returning utensils to their resting state is not simply resetting the room for the next use. It is a final act of respect toward the tools that made the gathering possible. Samurai who practiced here learned that how one ends a task often speaks more loudly than how one begins it. The bamboo scoop lies nearby, its tip faintly stained from the powder. You wipe it carefully with the fukusa, the silk folding over it like water over a pebble. The cloth's faint rustle is one of the last sounds the room will hear before the fire dies. You place each utensil in its appointed place, recreating the still life that existed before the first bow. The order is not arbitrary. It is a map of the gathering, read backward. The bowl, now empty, rests with its front facing the alcove, as though paying its own respects to scroll and flower. A fringe note worth repeating. Some hosts, in private practice, rearrange the utensils at the end in a slightly altered way, believing it keeps the next gathering from feeling like an exact repeat. Others insist on exact restoration, arguing that precision itself is the art. Neither side has won. The kettle lets out a last, quiet bubble, as though signaling that its role is finished. The iron will cool slowly, the heat lingering long after the guest steps outside. The scent of the tea remains in the air, mingling with the faint mineral trace of the water. Historians still argue whether the closing of the tea space was ever accompanied by spoken blessings, or whether such utterances were borrowed later from temple practice. The silence in most surviving descriptions suggests that words were either rare or too soft to record. You fold the fukusa one last time, corners meeting, silk lying flat. The cloth is warm from your hands, and you smooth it before placing it at your side. The mat beneath you carries a faint warmth too, where your knees have been. The guest's eyes follow your hands, but neither of you speaks. The room is at that delicate point where even a polite word could feel like dragging a wet brush across dry paper. Instead, you both sit in the shared understanding that the work is complete and nothing further is needed. You glance at the shoji, where the light has shifted toward the color of late afternoon. The day has moved without your asking, and the tea room has kept pace without hurry. You place your hands on your thighs, feeling the grain of the cloth beneath your fingers, and take one last slow breath before the final steps. You let your palms rest lightly on your thighs, feeling the small pulse in the base of each finger. The guest shifts his weight almost imperceptibly. The mat creaks in response. This is the sound of a gathering, leaning toward its close, not abrupt, but inevitable. Like the tide's retreat after a long hold, a mainstream fact drifts easily into the stillness. In the etiquette of chanoyu, the closing moments are as deliberate as the opening. The sequence of bows, the order of objects removed, even the timing of the guest's departure are guided by a rhythm that has changed little in centuries. Samurai learned here that leaving well was part of the art of arriving well. You glance toward the alcove. The scroll's brushstrokes seem softer now in the dimmer light, the flower in its vase still fresh but beginning to turn inward. You bow once toward them. This is not for the guest, but for the room itself. A fringe tidbit from an old record surfaces. Some hosts believed that the alcove, being the spiritual center of the tea room, should be acknowledged last before the guest departs, so that the space retains its dignity after human presence fades. Others argued the opposite, greeting and thanking it first so that the utensil's removal would not overshadow it. No one agrees which was correct, and perhaps that is why the practice still shifts from house to house. You gather the tea bowl, the whisk, the scoop, and the caddy in slow, deliberate order, each lifted with both hands and placed into the tray beside you. The tray itself is not ornate. Its service is to carry without drawing attention. The guest watches not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Seeing each object treated with care reinforces the worth of what just passed. Historians still argue whether the exact arrangement of utensils on the tray had symbolic meaning beyond convenience. Some suggest that the placement mirrored battle formations, a poetic echo of martial discipline, while others insist it was simply to prevent fragile pieces from knocking together. The kettle's lid is lifted one last time, more to release the final puff of steam than for any functional need. You inhale its faint metallic sweetness, a reminder of how water and fire conspired to make the afternoon. The lid is set back gently, so quietly that the guest's eyes close for a heartbeat, as if sealing the moment along with the iron. You shift your weight to kneel more upright, signaling the guest that the closing bows will soon follow. He adjusts in kind, the soft rustle of his robe blending with the kettle's fading breath. The two sounds together form an unintentional harmony, gone almost as soon as you notice it. A mainstream truth fits naturally here. The tea room's closing is not about erasing the meeting, but about folding it neatly so it can be carried away. Samurai valued this skill, compressing an encounter without breaking it, because it mirrored the discipline required in all formal departures, whether from a lord's presence or a battlefield. The guest bows first this time, a deep, slow lowering that speaks both gratitude and completion. You return the bow, neither rushing nor lingering. And when you rise, the room feels fractionally lighter, as though a small weight has been set aside. A fringe observation, passed from teacher to student with no paper trail. Some believed that the order of bows at the end guest before host was less about hierarchy and more about giving the host the last visual memory of the guest's respectful posture. Whether or not this was intentional, it shaped the way the moment was remembered. You place the tray of utensils beside the threshold to the preparation area. They will be cleaned again later, perhaps in silence, perhaps with a whispered thought for the next guest. For now, they wait like soldiers standing down at the day's end, still ready, but at ease. The light from the shoji has shifted to the deeper gold of late afternoon. The garden outside holds its shapes in shadow, each stone's outline softened. The guest glances once toward it, perhaps imagining the walk back through its stepping stones. You follow his gaze, but keep your eyes low, letting him have the view without the weight of your attention. Historians still argue whether guests were ever encouraged to linger in the garden after a gathering, or whether stepping beyond the tea room's threshold marked a clean break. Surviving diaries show both the quick return to the outer world and the slow fade among moss and bamboo. You bow again, the smallest of the day's bows, a signal without words that the formal part is done. The guest mirrors it. For a long moment, neither of you moves. The air between you has no urgency now, only the steady knowledge that it has been shared. The threshold to the outer world waits. Soon, the guest will cross it. You will follow later, carrying the faint scent of tea on your sleeves and the rhythm of the room in your bones. The day will move on, but the etiquette shaped in the quiet here will go with you both. You kneel a little longer than necessary, letting the last of the heat leave the iron, the last of the sweetness fade from the tongue. The room has returned to the shape it had before you began. Scroll, flower, kettle, bowl, except that everything has learned your pulse and settled it. Leaving is as ceremonial as entering, though walked backward and slower. You gather your sleeves, not to hurry them, but to remind them there is a doorway. The low door insists on humility again. You bow through it, a practiced curve that keeps pride from bumping its head. A mainstream fact follows you to the threshold. Tea rooms were built small on purpose, with entrances low enough that rank and armor could not squeeze in. Even the highest had to bow, and in that bow the habit of deference could be carried into halls where it was needed even more. Many warriors learned this here and found their shoulders remembering it later, unprompted. You slip your feet into the sandals, waiting on the veranda, pausing to straighten the straw so it does not fold at the heel. The garden's gravel offers its faint crunch, the day's first loud sound, though it is hardly loud. Moss holds cool in the shadow of stone. You pass the basin and dip the ladle, rinsing your hands and mouth with a gesture so simple it would be easy to forget it is a kind of vow. Enter clean, leave clean, carry cleanness where you go. A small fringe habit lingers at the gate. Some hosts place a smooth pebble near the path's first step, one that fits well in the palm. Guests who notice may pick it up, hold it for the length of the garden, and set it down again at the edge of the world beyond. It takes no words to understand what has been borrowed and returned. You do not take the pebble today, but you notice its patient weight, waiting for another hand. Light sifts through pine and bamboo, laying thin ladders across the stones. You step without breaking a rung. The tea room's quiet lengthens behind you rather than snapping shut, the way a sentence that ends with a soft consonant keeps breathing. Historians still argue whether the ceremony's effect on warrior conduct was lasting or merely local, whether a man who bowed in the morning could keep his voice low at noon. Letters praised temper, cooled by tea, but outcomes were always mixed. Some learned and some did not. The uncertainty remains, as honest as Clay's refusal to always fire the same. You pass the fence and its gate, the hinge giving a sigh you know well. Outside, farther voices stir market, horses, a child laughing into the back of his hand. You carry yourself through them, as if the bowl were still in your palm. The street's air has different rules, but your breath does not change its measure merely because the world is noisy. The tea's instruction has moved from wrists to spine, from spine to stride. You meet a retainer at the corner. He speaks a name, an appointment, a time that cannot be moved. You answer with a nod that is not a bow and not a refusal, and you see in his face a tiny ease, as if he expected a sharper edge. The room taught you not to sharpen what does not need sharpening. Not every message deserves a blade. Your sleeve crosses your chest differently now when the wind lifts it. Your hands find each other with less impatience when they wait. The simple rules: turn the bowl, lift with two hands, speak only of leaves and weather become less simple and more useful in places where bowls are made of faces and decisions. You do not need to say you have learned anything. You kneel differently in your mind, and that is enough. Before the compound's gate, you pause as though a guest in your own courtyard. The guard glances up and then away, satisfied. The camellia from the alcove is still thinking about opening, though you cannot see it. The kettle still remembers pine wind, though your ear is full of wheels. The scroll is still advising silence in a language without verbs. You pass under the lintel as one who has left his sandals at 1,000 thresholds, ready to speak, ready not to. The day will spend you as days do, but the ceremony, practiced until it slips under the skin, has given your spending a shape. When you sit, you will place your hands. When you stand, you will not scrape the floor with your heel. When you disagree, you will turn the bowl first in your mind and sip from the less decorated side. A samurai's etiquette is not built only of rules. It is built of rooms like this, repeated until the body does the bowing for you. You move on with the steady economy of someone carrying something you cannot see. It is only steam, only leaf, only a cloth folded and refolded until the hands remember. It is more than enough. The garden hush lingers even after you have left its stones. The day opens its many doors, voices, errands, the dry rasp of sandals, the soft complaint of gates, and you pass through them, as if rounding the edge of a calm pond. The breath you learned beside the kettle keeps its own count. Inhale to the length of a bamboo segment. Exhale to the slow bend of a pine branch. The body remembers the mat's weave and lays its weight gently on the earth, wherever the earth happens to be. You think of the iron kettle cooling in the dim room, a dark moon settling back into its square. You think of the camellia that may open this afternoon, or may decide to save itself for rain. You think of the scroll, whose ink does not need to be reread to be understood. These thoughts are not obligations. They are friendly shadows that walk beside you until the road brightens. A cart's wheel clicks against a stone and then remembers how to be smooth. The air has that faint sweetness of straw warmed by sun. Your hands, empty now, still close as if around a bowl, and then open, and then rest. The habit of turning the front away before sipping has turned into the habit of turning yourself away from the easy edge of argument before speaking. It happens without instruction. It happens because the room you left did not really close behind you. Let the sounds thin. Let the images soften. Let the day sit down on its own cushion and lower its gaze. You may walk or you may rest. The kettle is quiet now, and the embers are folding into themselves. There is nothing left to pour. There is nothing left to hurry. When sleep asks for a place, give it the mat by the window and the small pillow of your folded sleeve. Steam will remember how to rise. You will remember how to breathe. End of script. Sweet dreams.